Section 31 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley, Volume 2, Chapter 13. I choose to comfort myself by considering that even while I am lamenting my present uneasiness, it is passing away. Horace Walpole. An event occurred at this time which considerably altered the plans of Mr. and Mrs. Villiers. They had been invited to spend some time at Maristow Castle, and were about to proceed thither with Lord Maristow and his daughters, when the sudden death of Mr. Savile changed everything. He died of a malignant fever, leaving a young widow and no child to inherit his place in society. Through this unlooked-for event, Horatio became the immediate heir of his father's title. He stepped from the slighted position of a younger son into the rank of the eldest, and thus became another being in all men's eyes, but chiefly in his father's. Viscount Maristow had deeply regretted his son's foreign marriage, and argued against his choice of remaining abroad. He was a statesman, and conceived that Horatio's talents and eloquence would place him high among the legislators of St. Stephen's. The soundness of his understanding and the flowing brilliancy of his language were pledges of his success. But Savile was not ambitious. His imagination rose high above the empty honours of the world. To be useful was a better aim, but he did not conceive that his was a mind calculated to lead others in its train. Its framework was too delicate, too finely strung, to sound in accord with the many. He wanted the desire to triumph, and was content to adore truth in the temple of his own mind, without defacing its worship by truckling to the many falsehoods and errors which demand subserviency in the world. Lord Maristow had hitherto submitted to his disappointment, not without murmurs, but without making any great effort at victory. He had written many letters entreating his son to cast off the drowsy Neapolitan sloth. He had besought Villiers, previous to his departure the preceding year, to bring his cousin back with him, and this was all. The death of his eldest son quickened him to exertion. He resolved to trust no longer to written arguments, but to go himself to Italy, and by force of paternal authority or persuasions to induce his son to come back to his native country, and to fill with honour the post to which fortune had advanced him. He did not doubt that Horatio would himself feel the force of his new duties, but it would be clenching his purpose, and paying an agreeable compliment to Clorinda, to make this journey, and to bring them back with him when he returned. Whatever Mrs. Savile's distaste to England might be, it must yield to the necessity that now drew her thither. Lord Maristow could not imagine any resistance so violent as to impede his wishes. The projected journey charmed his daughters, saddened as they were by their recent loss. Lucy was overjoyed at the prospect of seeing her beloved brother. She felt sure that Clorinda would be brought to reason. And thus, with their hearts set upon one object, one idea, they bade adieu to Ethel and her husband, as if their career was to be as sunny and as prosperous as they doubted not that their own would be. Lord Maristow alone guessed how things might stand. "Edward, my dear boy," he said, "give me credit for great anxiety on your account. I wish this marriage of yours had not taken place. Then you might have roughed it as other young men do, and have been the better for a little tart experience. I do not like this shuffling on your father's part. I hear for a certainty that this marriage of his will come to nothing. The friends of the young lady are against it, and she is very young, and only an heiress by courtesy. Her father can give her as many tens of thousands as he pleases, but he has sworn not to give her a shilling if she marries without his consent, and he has forbidden Colonel Villiers his house. He still continues at Cheltenham, and assures every one that he is on safe ground, that the girl loves him, and that when once his, the father must yield. It is too ridiculous to see him playing a boy-lover's part at his time of life, trying to undermine a daughter's sense of duty, he who may soon be a grandfather. The poor little thing, I am told, is quite fascinated by his dashing manners and station in society. We shall see how it will end. I fear ill. Her father might pardon a runaway match with a lover of her own age, but he will never forgive the cold-blooded villainy, of a man of 3 times her age, who for gain, and gain only, is seeking to steal her from him. Such is the sum of what I am told by a friend of mine just arrived from Cheltenham. The whole thing is the farce of the day, and the stolen interviews of the lovers and the loud vulgarly spoken denunciations of her father vary the scene from a travesty of Romeo and Juliet to the comedies of Plautus or Molière. I beg your pardon, Edward, for my frankness, but I am angry. I have been used as a cat's paw. I have been treated unfairly. I was told that the marriage wanted but your signature. My representations induced you to offer to Miss Fitzhenry, and now you are a ruined man. I am hampered by my own family, and cannot come forward to your assistance. My advice is that you wait a little, and see what turn matters take. Once decided, however they conclude, strong representations shall be made to your father, and he shall be forced to render proper assistance. Then, if politics take a better turn, I may do something for you, or you can live abroad till better times. Villiers thanked Lord Maristow for his advice, and made no remarks either on his details or promises. He saw his own fate stretched drearily before him, but his pride made him strong to bear without any outward signs of wincing. He would suffer all, conceal all, and be pitied by none. The thought of Ethel alone made him weak. Were she sheltered during the storm which he saw gathering so darkly, he would have felt satisfied. What was to be done? To go abroad was to encounter beggary and famine. To remain exposed him to 1,000 insults and dangers from which there was no escape. Such were the whisperings of despair, but brighter hopes often visited him. All could not be so evil as it seemed. Fortune, so long his enemy, would yield at last 1 inch of ground, 1 inch to stand upon, where he might wait in patience for better days. Had he indeed done his utmost to avert the calamities he apprehended? Certainly not. Thus spoke his sanguine spirit. More could and should be done. His father might find means, he himself be enabled to arrange with his lawyer some mode of raising a sum of money which would at least enable him to go on the continent with his wife. He spent his thoughts and wishes for the attainment of this desirable conclusion to his adversity, till the very earnestness of his expectations seemed to promise their realization. It could not be that the worst would come. Absurd! Something must happen to assist them. Seeking for this unknown something, which in spite of all his efforts would take no visible or tangible form, he spent weary days and sleepless nights, his brain spinning webs of thought, not like those of the spider, useful to their weaver. A tangled skein they were rather, where the clue was inextricably hid. He did not speak of these things to Ethel, but he grew sad, and she was anxious to go out of town to have him all to herself, when she promised herself to dispel his gloom, and as she darkly guessed at the source of his disquietude, by economy and a system of rigid privation, to show him how willing and able she was to meet the adversity which he so much dreaded. End of Volume 2, Chapter 13. Section 32 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley, Volume 2, Chapter 14. The pure, the open, prosperous love that pledged on earth and sealed above grows in the world's approving eyes, in friendship's smile and home's caress, collecting all the heart's sweet ties into one knot of happiness. Lalla Rookh. Another month withered away in fruitless expectation. Villiers felt that he was following an ignis fatuus, yet knew not how to give up his pursuit. At length he listened more docilely to Ethel's representations of the expediency of quitting town. She wished to pay her long-promised visit to her aunt, and Villiers at last consented to accompany her. They gave up their house, dispersed a tolerably numerous establishment, and left town for their sober and rural seclusion in Essex. Taken from the immediate scene where care met him at every turn, Edward's spirits rose, and the very tranquillity and remoteness of Longfield became a relief and an enjoyment. It was bright October weather, the fields were green, the hedges yet in verdant trim. The air was so still that the dead leaves hung too lazy to fall from the topmost boughs of the earlier trees. The oak was still dressed in a dark, sober green. The fresh July shoot, having lost its summer hue, was unapparent among the foliage. The varying tints of beech, ash, and elm diversified the woods. The morning and evening skies were resplendent with crimson and gold, and the moonlight nights were sweeter than the day. Fatigued by the hurry of town, and one at least worn out with care, the young pair took a new lease of love in idleness in this lonely spot. A slight attack of rheumatism confined Aunt Bessie to her chimney corner, but in spite of her caution to Ethel not to incur the same penalty from all the array of wet walks and damp shoes, it was her best pleasure each morning to tie on her bonnet, take her husband's arm, and they wandered away together, returning only to find their horses ready, and then they departed for hours, coming back late and unwillingly after the sun was down. Mrs. Elizabeth wondered where all the beautiful spots were which Ethel described so enthusiastically as to be found in the neighborhood. The good lady longed to go out herself to see if she could not reap equal delight from viewing the grouping of trees whose various autumnal tints were painted in Ethel's speech with hues too bright for earth, or to discover what there could be so extraordinarily picturesque in a moss-grown cottage near a brook, with a high bank clothed with wood behind, which she believed must be one Dame Nixon's cottage in the Vale of Bewling, and which she knew she must have passed 1,000 times, and yet she had never noticed its beauty. Very often Ethel could give no information of whither they had been, only they had lost themselves in majestic woods, lingered in winding lanes which led to resplendent views, or even reached the margin of the barren sea, to behold the enveloping atmosphere reflected in its fitful mirror, to watch the progress of evanescent storms, or to see the moon light up her silvery pathway on the dusky waste. Villiers took his gun with him in his walks, but though American bred, Ethel was so unfeignedly distressed by the sight of death that he never brought down a bird. He shot in its direction now and then to keep his pointer in practice, and to laugh at his wife's glad triumph when he missed his feathery mark. Ethel was especially delighted to renew her acquaintance with Longfield, her father's boyhood home, under such sunny circumstances. She had loved it before, with anguish in her heart and heavy sadness weighing on her steps. She had loved it for his sake. But now that it became the home, the dedicated garden of love, it received additional beauty in her eyes from its association with the memory of Lord Lodore. All things conjoined, the season calmed and brightened, as if for her especial enjoyment, remembrance of the past, and the undivided possession of her Edward's society combined to steep her soul in happiness. Even he, whose more active and masculine spirit might have fretted in solitude and sloth, was subdued by care and uncertainty to look on the peace of the present moment as the dearest gift of the gods. Both so young, and the minds of both open as day to each other's eyes, no single blot obscured their intercourse. They never tired of each other, and the teeming spirit of youth filled the empty space of each hour as it came, with a new growth of sentiments and ideas. The long evening had its pleasures, with its close-drawn curtains and cheerful fire. Even whist with the white-haired parson and Mrs. Fitzhenry in her spectacles imparted pleasure. Could anything duller have been devised, which would have been difficult, it had not been so to them. And a stranger coming in and seeing their animated looks and hearing their cheerful tones and light-hearted laugh must have envied the very elysium of delight which Aunt Bessie's usually so sober drawing-room contained. merely to see Ethel leaning on her husband's arm and looking up in his face as he drew her yet closer, and while his fingers were twined among her silken ringlets, kissed so fondly her fair brow, must have demonstrated to a worldling the irrefragable truth that happiness is born a twin, love being the parent. The beauty of a pastoral picture has but short duration in this cloudy land, and happiness, the sun of our moral existence, is yet more fitful in its visitations. Villiers and his young wife took their accustomed ride through shady lanes and copses, and through parks, where, though the magnificent features of nature were wanting, the eye was delighted by a various prospect of wood and lawny upland. The soft, though wild west wind drove along vast masses of snowy clouds, which displayed in their intervals the deep stainless azure of the boundless sky. The shadows of the clouds now darkened the pathway of our riders, and now they saw the sunlight advance from a distance, coming on with steps of light and air, till it reached them, and they felt the warmth and gladness of sunshine descend on them. The various colored woods were now painted brightly in the beams, and now half lost in shadow. There was life and action everywhere, yet not the awakening activity of spring, but rather a vague, uneasy restlessness, allied to languor and pregnant with melancholy. Villiers was silent and sad. Ethel too well knew the cause wherefore he was dispirited. He had received letters that morning which stung him into a perception of the bitter realities which were gathering about them. One was to say that no communication had been received from his father, but that it was believed that he was somewhere in London. The other was from his banker, to remind him that he had overdrawn his credit, nearly the most disagreeable intelligence a man can hear when he possesses no immediate means of replenishing his drained purse. Ethel was grieved to see him pained, but she could not acutely feel these pecuniary distresses. She tried to divert his thoughts by conversation, and pointing out the changes which the advancing season made in the aspect of the country. "Yes," said Villiers, "it is a beautiful world. Poets tell us this, and religious men have drawn an argument for their creed from the wisdom and loveliness displayed in the external universe, which speaks to every heart and every understanding. The azure canopy fretted with golden lights, or, as now, curtained by wondrous shapes, which, though they are akin to earth, yet partake the glory of the sky, the green expanse, variegated by streams, teeming with life and prolific of food to sustain that life, and that very food the chief cause of the beauty we enjoy. With such magnificence has the Creator set forth our table. All this, and the winds that fan us so balmily, and the flowers that enchant our sight, do not all these make earth a type of heaven?" Ethel turned her eyes on him to read in his face the expression of the enthusiasm and enjoyment that seemed to dictate his words. But his countenance was gloomy, and as he continued to speak his expressions took more the color of his uneasy feelings. "How false and senseless all this really is," he pursued. "Find a people who truly make earth, its woods and fells and inclement sky, their unadorned dwelling place, who pluck the spontaneous fruits of the soil, or slay the animals as they find them, attending neither to culture nor property, and we give them the name of barbarians and savages, untaught, uncivilized, miserable beings, and we, the wiser and more refined, hunt and exterminate them. We who spend so many words, either as preachers or philosophers, to vaunt that with which they are satisfied, we feel ourselves the greater, the wiser, the nobler, the more barriers we place between ourselves and nature, the more completely we cut ourselves off from her generous but simple munificence." "But is this necessary?" asked the forest-bred girl. "When I lived in the wilds of the Illinois, the simplest abode, food, and attire were all I knew of human refinements, and I was satisfied." Villiers did not appear to heed her remark, but continued the train of his own reflections. The first desire of man is not for wealth nor luxury, but for sympathy and applause. He desires to remove to the furthest extremity of the world contempt and degradation, and according to the ideas of the society in which he is bred, so are his desires fashioned. We, the most civilized, high-bred, prosperous people in the world, make no account of nature unless we add the ideas of possession and of the labors of man. We rate each individual, and we all desire to be rated as individuals distinct from and superior to the mass, not by himself, but by his house, his park, his income. This is a trite observation, yet it appears new when it comes home. What is lower, humbler, more despicable than a poor man? Give him learning, give him goodness, see him with manners acquired in poverty, habits dyed in the dusky hues of penury, and if we do not despise him, yet we do not admit him to our tables or society. Refinement may only be the varnish of the picture, yet it is necessary to make apparent to the vulgar eye even the beauties of Raphael. To the vulgar eye, repeated Ethel emphatically. And I seem one of those by the way I speak, said Edward, smiling. Yet indeed I do not despise any man for being poor except myself. I can feel pride in showing honor where honor is due, even though clad in the uncouth and forbidding garb of plebeianism. But I cannot claim this for myself. I cannot demand the justice of men, which they would nickname pity. The Illinois would be preferable far. And the Illinois might be a paradise, said Ethel. We hope for a better. We hope for Italy. Do you remember Rome and the Colosseum, my love? Naples, the Chioggia, and San Carlo? These were better than the savannas of the West. Our hopes are good. It is the present only which is so thorny, so worse than barren. Like the souls of Dante, we have a fiery past to get through before we reach our place of bliss. That we have it in prospect will gift us with fortitude. Meanwhile, I must string myself to my task. Ethel, dearest, I shall go to town tomorrow. And I with you, surely. Do not ask it. This is your first lesson in the lore you were so ready to learn, of bearing all for me. With you, interrupted his wife. With me it shall soon be, replied Edward. But to speak according to the ways of this world, my presence in London is necessary for a few days, for a very few days. A journey there and back for me is nothing, but it would be a real and useless expense if you went. Indeed, Ethel, you must submit to my going without you. I ask it of you, and you will not refuse. A few days, you say, answered Ethel, a very few days. It is hard, but you will not be angry if I should join you if your return is delayed. You will not be so mad, said Villiers. I go with a light heart because I leave you in security and comfort. I will return. I need not protest. You know that I shall return the moment I can. I speak of a few days. It cannot be a week. Let me go then, with what satisfaction I may, to the den of darkness and toil, and not be farther annoyed by the fear that you will not support my absence with cheerfulness. As you love me, wait for me with patience. Remain with your aunt till I return. I will stay for a week if it must be so, replied Ethel. Indeed, my love, it must. Nor will I task you beyond. Before a week is gone by, you shall see me. Ethel looked wistfully at him, but said no more. She thought it hard. She did not think it right that he should go, that he should toil and suffer without her, but she had no words for argument or contention, so she yielded. The next morning, a cold but cheerful morning, at 7 o'clock, she drove over with him in Mrs. Fitzhenry's little pony chaise to the town 4 miles off, through which the stages passed. A first parting is a kind of landmark in life, a starting post whence we begin our career out of illusion and the land of dreams into reality and endurance. They arrived not a moment too soon. She had yet 1,000 things to say, 1 or 2 very particular things which she had reserved for the last moment. There was no time, and she was forced to concentrate all her injunctions into one word, write. "Every day, and do you. It will be my only pleasure," replied his wife. "Take care of yourself." He was on the top of the stage and gone, and Ethel felt that a blank loneliness had swallowed up the dearest joy of her life. She drew her cloak round her. She gazed along the road. There were no traces of him. She gave herself up to thought, and as he was the object of all her thoughts, this was her best consolation. She reviewed the happy days they had spent together. She dwelt on the memory of his unalterable affection and endearing kindness, and then tears rushed into her eyes. "Will any ill ever befall him?" she thought. "Oh no, none ever can. He must be rewarded for his goodness and his love. How dear he ought to be to me! Did he not take the poor friendless girl from solitude and grief, and disdaining neither her poverty nor her orphan state, give her himself, his care, his affection? Oh, my Edward, what would Ethel have been without you? Her father was gone, her mother repulsed her, she was alone in the wide world, till you generously made her your own." With the true enthusiasm of passion, Ethel delighted to magnify the benefits she had received, and to make those which she herself conferred nothing, that gratitude and love might become yet stronger duties. In her heart, though she reproached herself for what she termed selfishness, she could not regret his poverty and difficulties, if thus she should acquire an opportunity of being useful to him. But she felt herself defrauded of her best privileges of serving and consoling by their separation. Thus, now congratulating herself on her husband's attachment, now repining at the fate that divided them, agitated by various emotions too sweet and bitter for words, she returned to Longfield. Aunt Bessie was in her armchair, waiting for her to begin breakfast. Edward's seat was empty, his cup was not placed, he was omitted in the domestic arrangements. Tears rushed into her eyes, and in vain, trying to calm herself, she sobbed aloud. Aunt Bessie was astonished, and when all the explanation she got was, "He is gone," she congratulated herself that her single state had spared her the endurance of these conjugal distresses. End of Volume 2, Chapter 14.
Section 33 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley, Volume 2, Chapter 15. How like a winter hath my absence been from thee, the pleasure of the fleeting year! What freezings have I felt, what dark days seen, what old December's bareness everywhere. Shakespeare. Ethel cheered herself to amuse her aunt, and as in her days of hopeless love, she tried to shorten the hours by occupation. It was difficult, for all her thoughts were employed in conjectures as to where Edward was, what doing, in looking at her watch and following in her mind all his actions, or in meditating how hereafter she might remedy any remissness on her part, so tender was her conscience, and best contribute to his happiness. Such reveries beguiled many hours, and enabled her to endure with some show of courage the pains of absence. Each day she heard from him, each day she wrote, and this entire pouring out of herself on paper formed the charm of her existence. She endeavored to persuade him how fortunate their lot might hereafter be, how many of his fears were unfounded or misplaced. "Remember, dearest love," she said, "that I have nothing of the fine lady about me. I do not even feel the want of those luxuries so necessary to most women. This I owe to my father. It was his first care, while he brought me up in the most jealous retirement, to render me independent of the services of others. Solitude is to me no evil, and the delight of my life would be to wait upon you. I am not, therefore, an object of pity. When fortune deprives me of the appurtenances of wealth, which rather annoy than serve me, my devotion and sacrifice, as you are pleased to call the intense wish of my heart to contribute to your happiness, are nothing. I sacrifice all when I give up 1 hour of your society. There is the sting, there the merit of my permitting you to go without me. I can ill bear it. I am impatient and weak. Do not then, Edward dearest, task me too far. Recall me to your side if your return is delayed. Recall your fond girl to the place near your heart where she desires to remain forever. Villiers answered with few but expressive words of gratitude and fidelity. His letters breathed disappointment and anxiety. "It is too true," he said. "As I found it announced when I first came to town, my father is married. He got the banns published in an obscure church in London. He persuaded Miss Gregory to elope with him, and they are married. Her father is furious. He returns every letter unopened. His house and heart, he says, are still open to his daughter, but I will not repeat his words, who stole her from him, shall never benefit by a shilling of his money. Let her return, and all shall be pardoned. Let her remain with her husband, and starve he cares not. My father has spent much time and more money on this pursuit. In the hope of securing many thousands, he raised hundreds at a prodigal and ruinous interest, which must now be paid. He has not £10 in the world, so he says. My belief is that he is going abroad to secure to himself the payment of the scanty remnant of his income. I have no hopes. I would beg at the corner of a street rather than apply to a man who never has been a parent to me, and whose last act is that of a villain. Excuse me, you will be angry that I speak thus of my father, but I know that he speaks of the poor girl he has deluded with a bitterness and insult which prove what his views were in marrying her. In this moment of absolute beggary, my only resource is to raise money. I believe I shall succeed, and the moment I have put things in train, with what heartfelt, what unspeakable joy shall I leave this miserable place for my own Ethel's side, long to remain." Villiers' letters varied little, but yet they got more desponding, and Ethel grew very impatient to see him again. She had counted the days of her week; they were fulfilled, and her husband did not return. Everything depended, he said, on his presence, and he must remain yet for another day or two. At first he implored her to be patient. He besought her, as she loved him, to endure their separation yet for a few more days. His letters were very short, but all in this style. They were imperative with his wife. She obeyed, yet she did so, she told him, against her will and against her sense of right. She ought to be at his side to cheer him under his difficulties. She had married him because she loved him, and because the first and only wish of her heart was to conduce to his happiness. To travel together, to enjoy society and the beauties of nature in each other's society were indeed blessings, and she valued them, but there was another, dearer still, of which she felt herself defrauded, and for which she yearned. "The aim of my life, and its only real joy," she said, "is to make your existence happier than it would have been without me. When I know and feel that such a moment or hour has been passed by you with sensations of pleasure, and that through me, I have fulfilled the purpose of my destiny. Deprived of the opportunity to accomplish this, I am bereft of that for which I breathe. You speak as if I were better off here than if I shared the inconveniences of your lot. Is not this strange language, my own Edward? You talk of security and comfort. Where can I be so secure as near you? And for comfort, what heart-elevating joy it would be to exchange this barren, meagre scene of absence for the delight, the comfort of seeing you, of waiting on you. I do not ask you to hasten your return, so as to injure your prospects, but permit me to join you. Would not London itself, dismal as you describe it, become sunny and glad if Ethel were with you?" To these adjurations Villiers scarcely replied. Time crept on. 3 weeks had already elapsed. Now and then a day intervened, and he did not write, and his wife's anxiety grew to an intolerable pitch. She did not for an instant suspect his faith, but she feared that he must be utterly miserable, since he shrunk from communicating his feelings to her. His last letter was brief. "I have just come from my solicitor," he said, "and have but time to say that I must go there again tomorrow, so I shall not be with you. Oh, the heavy hours in this dark prison! You will reward me and make me forget them when I see you, but how shall I pass the time till then?" These words made Ethel conceive the idea of joining him in town. He could not be angry. He could not bring his mind to ask her to share his discomforts, but ought she not to volunteer, to insist upon his permitting her to come? Permit! The same pride that prevented his asking would induce him to refuse her request. But should she do wrong if, without his express permission, she were to join him? A thrill, half fear, half transport, made her heart's blood stand still at the thought. The day after this last she got no letter. The following day was Monday, and there would be no post from town. Her resolution was taken, and she told her aunt that she should go up to London the following day. Mrs. Elizabeth knew little of the actual circumstances of the young pair. Villiers had made it an express condition that she should not be informed of their difficulties, for he was resolute not to take from her little store, which, in the way she lived, was sufficient, yet barely so, for her wants. She did not question her niece as to the journey. She imagined that it was a thing arranged. But Ethel herself was full of perplexity. She remembered what Villiers had said of expense. She knew that he would be deeply hurt if she used a public conveyance, and yet to go post would consume the little money she had left, and she did not like to reach London penniless. She began to talk to her aunt, and faltered out something about want of money for posting. The good lady's purse was instantly in her hand. Ethel had not the same horror as her husband of pecuniary obligation. She was too inexperienced to know its annoyances, and in the present instance to receive a small sum from her aunt appeared to her an affair that did not merit hesitation. She took £20 for her journey, and felt her heart lighter. There yet remained another question. Hitherto they had travelled in their own carriage, with a valet and lady's maid. Villiers had taken his servant to town with him. In a postscript to one of his letters he said, "I was able to recommend Laurie to a good place, so I have parted with him, and I shall not take another servant at this moment." Laurie had been long and faithfully attached to her husband, who had never lived without an attendant, and who from his careless habits was peculiarly helpless. Ethel felt that this dismissal was a measure of economy, and that she ought to imitate it. Still, as any measure to be taken always frightened her, she had not courage to discharge her maid, but resolved to go up to town without her. Aunt Bessie was shocked at her going alone, but Ethel was firm. Nothing could happen to her, and she should prove to Edward her readiness to endure privation. On Monday, at 11 in the forenoon, on the 28th of November, Ethel, having put together but a few things, for she expected a speedy return, stepped into her travelling chariot and began her journey to town. She was all delight at the idea of seeing Edward. She reproached herself for having so long delayed giving this proof of her earnest affection. She listened with beaming smiles to all her aunt's injunctions and cautions, and, the carriage once in motion, drawing her shawl round her as she sat in the corner, looking on the despoiled yet clear prospect, her mind was filled with the most agreeable reveries, her heart soothed by the dearest anticipations. to pay the post-horses, to gift the postilion herself were all events for her. She felt proud. Edward said, "I must begin to learn the ways of the world, and this is my first lesson in economy and care," she thought, as she put into the post-boy's hand just double the sum he had ever received before. "And how good and attentive and willing everybody is! I am sure women can very well travel alone. Every one is respectful and desirous to serve," was her next internal remark, as she undrew her little silken purse to give a waiter half a crown who had brought her a glass of water, and whose extreme alacrity struck her as so very kind-hearted. Her spirits flagged as the day advanced. In spite of herself, an uneasy feeling diffused itself through her mind when, the sun going down, a misty, chilly twilight crept over the landscape. Had she done right, she asked herself? Would Edward indeed be glad to see her? She felt half frightened at her temerity, alarmed at the length of her journey, timid when she thought of the vast London she was about to enter without any certain bourne. She supposed that Villiers went each day to his club, and she knew that he lodged in Duke Street, St. James's. But she was ignorant of the number of the house, and the street itself was unknown to her. She did not remember ever to have been in it in her life. Her carriage entered labyrinthine London by Blackwall, and threaded the wilds of Lothbury. A dense and ever-thickening mist, palpable, yellow, and impervious to the eye, enveloped the whole town. Ethel had heard of a November fog, but she had never witnessed one, and the idea of it did not occur to her memory. She was half frightened, thinking that some strange phenomena were going on, and fancying that her postilion was hurrying forward in terror. At last, in Cheapside, they stopped, jammed up by carts and coaches, and then she contrived to make herself heard, asking what was the matter. The word eclipse hung upon her lips. "Only, ma'am, the street has got blocked up like in the fog. We shall get on presently." The word fog solved the mystery, and again her thoughts were with Villiers. What a horrible place for him to live in! And he had been enduring all this wretchedness while she was breathing the pure atmosphere of the country. Again they proceeded through the murky air, and through an infinitude of mischances. The noise, the hubbub, the crowd, as she could distinguish it, as if veiled by dirty gauze, by the lights in the shops, all agitated and vexed her. Through Fleet Street and the Strand they went, and it seemed as if their progress would never come to an end. The whole previous journey from Longfield was short in comparison to this tedious procession. 20 times she longed to get out and walk. At last they got free, and with a quicker pace drove up to the door of the Union Club in Charing Cross. The postboy called one of the waiters to the carriage door, and Ethel asked, "Is Mr. Villiers here?" "Mr. Villiers, ma'am, has left town." Ethel was aghast. She had watched assiduously along the road, yet she had felt certain that if he had meant to come, she would have seen him on Sunday, and till this moment she had not entertained a real doubt but that she should find him. She asked falteringly, "When did he go?" "Last week, ma'am. Last Thursday, I think it was." Ethel breathed again. The man's information must be false. She was too inexperienced to be aware that servants and common people have a singular tact in selecting the most unpleasant intelligence and being very alert in communicating it. "Do you know," she inquired, "where Mr. Villiers lodges?" "Can't say indeed, ma'am, but the porter knows. Here, Saunders." No Saunders answered. "The porter's not in the way, but if you can wait, ma'am, he'll be back presently." The waiter disappeared. The postboy came up. He touched his hat. "Wait," said Ethel. "We must wait a little," and he removed himself to the horses' heads. Ethel sat in her lonely corner, shrouded by fog and darkness, watching every face as it passed under the lamp near, fancying that Edward might appear among them. The ugly faces that haunt, in quick succession, the imagination of one oppressed by nightmare might vie with those that passed successively in review before Ethel. Most of them hurried on, looking neither to the right nor left. Some entered the house, some glanced at her carriage, one or two, perceiving a bonnet, evidently questioned the waiter. He stood there for her own service, Ethel thought, and she watched his every movement, his successive disappearances and returns, the people he talked to. Once she signed to him to come, but "No, ma'am, the porter has not come back yet," was all his answer. At last, after having stood half whistling for some 5 minutes, it appeared to Ethel half an hour, without having received any visible communication, he suddenly came up to the carriage door, saying, "The porter could not stay to speak to you, ma'am, he was in such a hurry. He says Mr. Villiers lodges in Duke Street, St. James's. He should know the house, but has forgotten the number." "Then I must wait till he comes back again. I knew all that before. Will he be long?" "A long time, ma'am. 2 hours at least. He said that the woman of the house is a widow woman, Mrs. Durham." Thus, as if by torture, but, as with the whipping boys of old, hers was the torture, not the delinquent's, Ethel extracted some information from the stupid, conceited fellow. On she went to Duke Street to discover Mrs. Durham's residence. A few wrong doors were knocked at, and a beer-boy at last was the mercury that brought the impatient, longing wife to the threshold of her husband's residence. Happy beer-boy! She gave him a sovereign. He had never been so rich in his life before. Such chance medleys do occur in this strange world. End of Volume 2, Chapter 15. Recording by Linda Johnson. Section 34 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley. Volume 2, Chapter 16. Oh, my reviving joy! Thy quickening presence makes the sad night sit like a youthful spring upon my blood. I cannot make thy welcome rich enough with all the wealth of words. Middleton. The boy knocked at the door. A servant girl opened it. "Does Mr. Villiers lodge here?" asked the postilion from his horse. "Yes," said the girl. "Open the door quickly and let me out!" cried Ethel, as her heart beat fast and loud. The door was opened, the steps let down, operations tedious beyond measure, as she thought. She got out and was in the hall going upstairs. "Mr. Villiers is not at home," said the maid. Through the low blinds of the parlor window, Mrs. Durham had been watching what was going on. She heard what her servant said and now came out. "Mr. Villiers is not at home," she reiterated. "Will you leave any message?" "No, I will wait for him. Show me into his room." "I am afraid that it is locked," answered Mrs. Durham repulsively. "Perhaps you can call again. Who shall I say asked for him?" "Oh, no!" cried Ethel. "I must wait for him. Will you permit me to wait in your parlor? I am Mrs. Villiers." "I beg pardon," said the good woman. "Mrs. Villiers is in the country." "And so I am," replied Ethel. "At least, so I was this morning. Don't you see my traveling carriage? Look. You may be sure that I am Mrs. Villiers." She took out of her little bag one of Edward's letters, with the perusal of which she had beguiled much of her way to town. Mrs. Durham looked at the direction, the Honourable Mrs. Villiers. Her countenance brightened. Mrs. Durham was a little, plump, well-preserved woman of 54 or 5. She was kind-hearted, and, of course, shared the worship for rank which possesses every heart born within the 4 seas. She was now all attention. Villiers's room was open. He was expected very soon. "He is so seldom out in an evening. It is very unlucky, but he must be back directly," said Mrs. Durham, as she showed the way up the narrow staircase. Ethel reached the landing and entered a room of tolerable dimensions, considerably encumbered with litter, which opened into a smaller room with a tent bed. A little bit of fire glimmered in the grate. The whole place looked excessively forlorn and comfortless. Mrs. Durham bustled about to bestow a little neatness on the room, saying something of the untidiness of gentlemen, and so many lodgers in the house. Ethel sat down. She longed to be alone. There was the post-boy to be paid, and to be ordered to take the carriage to a coach-house. And then Mrs. Durham asked her if she would not have something to eat. She herself was at tea, and offered a cup, which Ethel thankfully accepted, acknowledging that she had not eaten since the morning. Mrs. Durham was shocked. The rank beauty and sweet manners of Ethel had made a conquest, which her extreme youth redoubled. "So young a lady," she said, "to go about alone! She did not know how to take care of herself, she was sure. She must have some supper. A roast chicken should be ready in an hour, by the time Mr. Villiers came in." "But the tea," said Ethel, smiling. "You will let me have that now?" Mrs. Durham hurried away on this hint, and the young wife was left alone. She had been married a year, but there was still a freshness about her feelings, which gave zest to every change in her wedded life. "This is where he has been living without me," she thought. "Poor Edward! It does not look as if he were very comfortable." She rose from her seat and began to arrange the books and papers. A glove of her husband's lay on the table. She kissed it with a glad feeling of welcome. When the servant came in, she had the fire replenished, the hearth swept, and in a minute or two the room had lost much of its disconsolate appearance. Then, with a continuation of her feminine love of order, she arranged her own dress and hair, giving to her attire, as much as possible, an at-home appearance. She had just finished, just sat down, and begun to find the time long, when a quick, imperative knock at the door, which she recognized at once, made her heart beat and her cheek grow pale. She heard a step, a voice, and Mrs. Durham answer, "Yes, sir, the fire is in, everything comfortable." And Ethel opened the door as she spoke, and in an instant was clasped in her husband's arms. It was not a moment whose joy could be expressed by words. He had been miserable during her absence, and had thought of sending for her, but he looked round his single room, remembered that he was in lodgings, and gave up his purpose with a bitter murmur. And here she was, uncalled for, but most welcome. She was here, in her youth, her loveliness, her sweetness. These were charms, but others more transcendent now attended on and invested her. The sacred tenderness of a wife had led her to his side, and love, in its most genuine and beautiful shape, shed an atmosphere of delight and worship about her. Not one circumstance could alloy the unspeakable bliss of their meeting. Poverty and its humiliations vanished from before the eyes of Villiers. He was overflowingly rich in the possession of her affections, her presence. Again and again he thanked her in broken accents of expressive transport. "Nothing in the whole world could make me unhappy now," he cried. And Ethel, who had seen his face look elongated and gloomy at the moment he had entered, felt indeed that Medea, with all her potent herbs, was less of a magician than she in the power of infusing the sparkling spirit of life into one human frame. It was long before either were coherent in their inquiries and replies. There was nothing, indeed, that either wished to know. Life and its purposes were fulfilled, rounded, complete, without a flaw. They loved and were together. Together, not for a transitory moment, but for the whole duration of the eternity of love, which never could be exhausted in their hearts. After more than an hour spent in gradually becoming acquainted and familiar with the transporting change, From separate loneliness to mutual society and sympathy, the good-natured face of Mrs. Derham showed itself, to announce that Ethel's supper was ready. These words brought back to Edward's recollection his wife's journey and consequent fatigues. He grew more desirous than Mrs. Derham to feed his poor famished bird, whose eyes, in spite of the joy that shone in them, began to look languid, and whose cheek was pale. The little supper table was laid, and they sat down together. Lady Mary Wortley Montague has recorded the pleasure to be reaped. When we meet with champagne and a chicken at last. And perhaps social life contains no combination so full of enjoyment as a tête-à-tête supper. Here it was, with its highest zest. They feared no prying eyes, they knew no ill. It was not a scanty hour of joy snatched from an age of pain, a single spark illuminating a long blank night. It came after separation, and possessed, therefore, the charm of novelty. But it was the prelude to a long reunion, the seal set on their being once again joined, to go through together each hour of the livelong day. Full of unutterable thankfulness and gladness, as were the minds of each, there was, besides, a sacred and home-felt delight, a sober certainty of waking bliss, which is the crown and fulfilment of perfect human happiness. Imparadised by each other's presence, no doubt, no fear of division on the morrow, no dread of untoward event, suspicion or blame clouded the balmy atmosphere which their hearts created around them. No Eden was required to enhance their happiness. There needed no crisped brooks rolling on orient pearl and sands of gold, no happy rural seat with a various view, decked with flowers of all hue, all trees of noblest kind for sight, smell, taste, nor cool recess, nor vernal airs breathing the smell of field and grove. In their narrow abode, their nook of a room, cut off from the world, redolent only of smoke and fog, their two fond hearts could build up bowers of delight and store them with all of ecstasy which the soul of man can know, without any assistance of eye or ear or scent. So rich and prodigal and glorious in its gifts is faithful and true-hearted love, when it knows the sacrifices which it must make to merit them, and consents willingly to forego vanity, selfishness, and the exactions of self-will in unlimited and unregretted exchange. Mutual esteem and gratitude sanctified the unreserved sympathy which made each so happy in the other. Did they love the less for not loving in sin and fear? Far from it. The certainty of being the cause of good to each other tended to foster the most delicate of all passions, more than the rougher ministrations of terror, and a knowledge that each was the occasion of injury to the other. A woman's heart is peculiarly unfitted to sustain this conflict. Her sensibility gives keenness to her imagination, and she magnifies every peril and writhes beneath every sacrifice which tends to humiliate her in her own eyes. The natural pride of her sex struggles with her desire to confer happiness, and her peace is wrecked. Far different was the happy Ethel's situation. Far otherwise were her thoughts employed than in concealing the pangs of care and shame. The sense of right adorned the devotion of love. She read approbation in Edward's eyes, and drew near him in full consciousness of deserving it. They sat at their supper, and long after by the cheerful fire, talking of 1,000 things connected with the present and the future, the long, long future which they were to spend together, and every now and then their eyes sparkled with the gladness of renewed delight in seeing each other. Mine, my own, forever! And was this exultation in possession to be termed selfish? By no other reasoning, surely, than that used by a cold and meaningless philosophy, which gives this name to generosity and truth, and all the nobler passions of the soul, they congratulated themselves on this mutual property, partly because it had been a free gift one to the other, partly because they looked forward to the right it ensured to each of conferring mutual benefits, and partly through the instinctive love God has implanted for that which, being ours, is become the better part of ourselves. They were united for better and worse, and there was a sacredness in the thought of the worse they might share, which gave a mysterious and celestial charm to the present better. End of Volume 2, Chapter 16. Recording by Linda Johnson. Section 35 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley. Volume 2, Chapter 17. Do you not think yourself truly happy? You have the abstract of all sweetness by you, the precious wealth youth labors to arrive at, nor is she less in honor than in beauty. Beaumont and Fletcher. The following day was one of pouring, unintermitting rain. Villiers and Ethel drew their chairs near their cheerful fire and were happy. Edward could not quite conquer his repugnance to seeing his wife in lodgings, and in those also of so mean and narrow a description. But the spirit of Ethel was more disencumbered of earthly particles. That had found its rest in the very home of love. The rosy light of the divinity invested all things for her. Cleopatra on the Cydnus, in the bark which, like a burnished throne, burnt on the water, borne along by purple sails, so perfumed that the winds were lovesick with them, was not more gorgeously attended than Ethel was to her own fancy, lapped and cradled in all that love has of tender, voluptuous, and confiding. Several days passed before Villiers could withdraw her from this blissful dream to gaze upon the world as it was. He could not make her disgusted with her fortunes nor her abode, but he awakened anxiety on his own account. His father, as he had conjectured, was gone to Paris, leaving merely a message for his son, that he would willingly join him in any act for raising money, by mortgage or the absolute disposal of a part of the estate. Edward had consulted with his solicitor, who was to look over a vast variety of papers to discover the most eligible mode of making some kind of sale. Delay, in all its various shapes, waited on these arrangements, and Villiers was very averse to leaving town till he held some clue to the labyrinth of obstacles which presented themselves at every turn. He talked of their taking a house in town, but Ethel would not hear of such extravagance. In the first place, their actual means were at a very low ebb, with little hope of a speedy supply. There was another circumstance, the annoyance of which he understood far better than Ethel could. He had raised money on annuities, the interest of which he was totally unable to pay. This exposed him to a personal risk of the most disagreeable kind, and he knew that his chief creditor was on the point of resorting to harsh measures against him. These things, dingy-visaged, dirty-handed realities as they were, made a strange contrast with Ethel's feeling of serene and elevated bliss, but she, with unshrinking heart, brought the same fortitude and love into the crooked and sordid ways of modern London which had adorned heroines of old as they wandered amidst trackless forests and over barren mountains. Several days passed, and the weather became clear though cold. The young pair walked together in the parks at such morning hours as would prevent their meeting any acquaintances, for Edward was desirous that it should not be known that they were in town. Villiers also traced his daily, weary, disappointing way to his solicitor, where he found things look more blank and dismal each day. Then, when evening came and the curtains were drawn, they might have been at the top of Mount Caucasus instead of in the centre of London, so completely were they cut off from everything except each other. They then felt absolutely happy. The lingering disgusts of Edward were washed clean away by the bounteous, ever-springing love that flowed, as waters from a fountain, from the heart of Ethel in one perpetual tide. In those hours of unchecked talk she learned many things she had not known before. The love of Horatio Saville for Lady Lodore was revealed to her, but the story was not truly told, for the prejudices as well as the ignorance of Villiers rendered him blind to the sincerity of Cornelia's affection and regret. Ethel wondered, and in spite of the charm with which she delighted to invest the image of her mother, she could not help agreeing with her husband that she must be irrevocably wedded to the most despicable worldly feelings, so to have played with the heart of a man such as Horatio, a man whose simplest word bore the stamp of truth and genius, one of those elected few whom nature elevates to her own high list of nobility and greatness. How could she, a simple girl, interest feelings which were not alive to Saville's merits? She could only hope that in some dazzling marriage Lady Lodore would find a compensation for the higher destiny which might have been hers, but that, like the base Indian, she had thrown a pearl away, richer than all his tribe. There was a peaceful quiet in their secluded and obscure life, which somewhat resembled the hours spent on board ship, when you long for, yet fear, the conclusion of the voyage, and shrink involuntarily from exchanging a state, whose chief blessing is an absence of every care, for the variety of pains and pleasures which chequer life. Ethel possessed her all, so near, so undivided, so entirely her own, that she could not enter into Villiers' impatience, nor quite sympathize with the disquietude he could not repress. After considerable delays, his solicitor informed him that his father had so entirely disposed of all his interest in the property that his readiness to join in any act of sale would be useless. The next thing to be done was for Edward to sell a part of his expectations, and the lawyer promised to find a purchaser, and begged to see him 3 days hence, when no doubt he should have some proposal to communicate. Whoever has known what such things are, whoever has waited on the demurs and objections, and suffered the alternations of total failure and suddenly renewed hopes, which are the Tantalus food held to the lips of those under the circumstances of Villiers, can follow in imagination his various conferences with his solicitor, as day after day something new was discovered, still to drag on or to impede the tortoise pace of his negotiations. It will be no matter of wonder to such that a month instead of 3 days wasted away, and found him precisely in the same position, with hopes a little raised, though so frequently blasted, and nothing done. In recording the annoyances, or rather the adversity which the young pair endured at this period, a risk is run, on the one hand, of being censured for bringing the reader into contact with degrading and sordid miseries, and on the other of laying too much stress on circumstances which will appear to those in a lower sphere of life as scarcely deserving the name of misfortune. It is very easy to embark on the wild ocean of romance, and to steer a danger-fraught passage amidst giant perils. The very words employed excite the imagination and give grace to the narrative. But all beautiful and fairy-like as was Ethel Villiers in tracing her fortunes, it is necessary to descend from such altitudes, to employ terms of vulgar use, and to describe scenes of commonplace and debasing interest, so that if she herself, in her youth and feminine tenderness, does not shed light and holiness around her, we shall grope darkling and fail utterly in the scope which we proposed to ourselves in selecting her history for the entertainment of the reader. End of Volume 2, Chapter 17. Recording by Linda Johnson. Section 36 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley, Volume 2, Chapter 18. I saw her upon nearer view, a spirit, yet a woman too, a creature not too bright or good for human nature's daily food, for transient sorrows, simple wiles, praise, blame, love, kisses, tears, and smiles. Wordsworth. The end of December had come. New Year's Day found and left them still in Duke Street. On the 4th of January, Villiers received a letter from his uncle Lord Maristow, entrusting a commission to him, which obliged him to go to the neighbourhood of Egham. Not having a horse, he went by the stage. He set out so late in the day that there was no chance of his returning the same night, and he promised to be back early on the morrow. Ethel had letters to write to Italy and to her aunt, and with these she tried to beguile the time. She felt lonely. The absence of Villiers for so many hours engendered an anxiety which she found some difficulty in repressing. Accustomed to have him perpetually at her side, and without any other companion or resource, she repined at her solitude. There was his empty chair, and no hope that he would occupy it. And she sat in her little room so near to thousands, and yet so cut off from every one, with such a sense of desolation as Mungo Park might have felt in Central Africa, or a shipwrecked mariner on an uninhabited island. Her pen was taken up, but she did not write. She could not command her thoughts to express anything but the overflowing, devoted, all-engrossing affection of her heart, her adoration for her husband. That would not amuse Lucy, she thought, and she had commenced another sheet with "My dearest aunt," when the maid-servant ushered a man into her presence, a stranger, a working man. What could he want with her? He seemed confused, and stammered out, "Mr. Villiers is not in?" "He will be at home to-morrow, if you want him, or have you any message that I can give?" "You are Mrs. Villiers, ma'am?" "Yes, my good man, I am Mrs. Villiers." "If you please, ma'am, I'm Saunders, one of the porters at the Union Club." "I remember. Has any message come there? Or does Mr. Villiers owe you any money?" And her purse was in her hand. "Oh, no, ma'am. Mr. Villiers is a good gentleman, and he has been particular generous to me, and that's why I come, because I'm afraid," continued the man, lowering his tone, "that he is in danger." "Good heavens! Where? How?" cried Ethel, starting from her chair. "Tell me at once." "Yes, ma'am, I will. So you must know that this evening—" "Yes, this evening? What has happened? He left me at 6 o'clock. What is it?" "Nothing, I hope, this evening, ma'am. I'm only afraid for tomorrow morning, and I will tell you all I know as quick as ever I can." The man then proceeded to relate that someone had been inquiring about Mr. Villiers at the club-house. One of the servants had told him that he lived in Duke Street, St. James's, and that was all he knew. But Saunders came up, and the man questioned him. He instantly recognized the fellow, and knew what his business must be, and he tried to deceive him, and declared that Mr. Villiers was gone out of town. But the fellow said that he knew better than that, and that he had been seen that very day in the Strand. He should look for him, no thanks to Saunders, in Duke Street. "And so, ma'am, you see they'll be sure to be here early tomorrow morning, so don't let Mr. Villiers stay here on no account whatsomever." "Why?" asked Ethel simply. "They can't hurt him." "I'm sure, ma'am," said Saunders, his face brightening. "I'm very glad to hear that. You know best. They will arrest him for sure, but—" "Arrest him?" "Yes, ma'am, for I've seen the tall one before. There were 2 of 'em bailiffs." Ethel now began to tremble violently. These were strange cabalistic words to her, the more awful from their mystery. "What am I to do?" she exclaimed. "Mr. Villiers will be here in the morning. He sleeps at Egham, and will be here early. I must go to him directly." "I'm glad to hear he's so far. said Saunders, "and if I can be of any use, you have but to say it. Shall I go to Egham? There are night coaches that go through, and I might warn him." Ethel thought. She feared to do anything. She imagined that she should be watched, that all her endeavours would be of no avail. She looked at the man. Honesty was written on his face, but there was no intelligence, nothing to tell her that his advice was good. The possibility of such an event as the present had never occurred to her. Villiers had been silent with regard to his fears on this head. She was suddenly transported into a strange sea, hemmed in by danger without a pilot or knowledge of a passage. Again she looked at the man's face. "What is best to be done?" she exclaimed. "I'm sure, ma'am," he replied, as if she had asked him the question, "I think what I said is best. If you will tell me where I can find Mr. Villiers, I should think nothing of going, and he could send word by me what he wished you to do." "Yes, that would indeed be a comfort. I will write 3 lines, and you shall take them." In a moment she had written. "Give this note into his own hand. He will sleep there. I have written the direction of the house, or at some inn at Egham. Do not rest till you have given the letter, and here is for your trouble." She held out 2 sovereigns. "Depend on me, ma'am, and I will bring an answer to you by 9 in the morning. Mr. Villiers will pay me what he thinks fit. You may want your money. Only, ma'am, don't be frightened when them men come tomorrow. If the people here are good sort of folks, you had better give them a hint. It may save you trouble." "Thank you. You are a good man, and I will remember you and reward you. By 9 tomorrow you will be punctual?" The man again assured her that he would use all diligence, and took his leave. Ethel felt totally overwhelmed by these tidings. The unknown is always terrible, and the ideas of arrest and prison and bolts and bars and straw floated before her imagination. Was Villiers safe even where he was? Would not the men make inquiries, learn where he had gone, and follow him, even if it were to the end of the world? She had heard of the activity employed to arrest criminals, and mingled every kind of story in her head, till she grew desperate from terror. Not knowing what else to do, she became eager for Mrs. Derham's advice, and hurried downstairs to ask it. She had not seen much of the good lady since her first arrival. Every day, when Villiers went out, she came up indeed on the momentous question of orders for dinner, and then she bestowed the benefit of some 5 or 10 minutes' garrulity on her fair lodger. Ethel learnt that she had seen better days, and that, were justice done her, she ought to be riding in her coach instead of letting lodgings. She learned that she had a married daughter living at Kennington, poor enough, but struggling on cheerfully with her mother's help. The best girl in the world she was, and a jewel of a wife, and had 2 of the most beautiful children that ever were beheld. This was all that Ethel knew, except that once Mrs. Derham had brought her one of her grandchildren to be seen and admired. In all that the good woman said, there was so much kindness, such a cheerful endurance of the ills of life, and she had shown such a readiness to oblige, that the idea of applying to her for advice relieved Ethel's mind of much of its load of anxiety. She was too much agitated to think of ringing for the servant to ask to see her, but hurried downstairs and knocked at the parlour door almost before she was aware of what she was doing. "Come in," said a feminine voice. Ethel entered, and started to see one she knew, and yet again she doubted. Was it indeed Fanny Derham whom she beheld? The recognition afforded mutual pleasure, checked a little on Ethel's part by her anxieties, and on Fanny's by a feeling that she had been neglected by her friend. A few letters had passed between them when first Ethel had visited Longfield. Since then their correspondence had been discontinued till after her return to England from Italy, when Mrs. Villiers had wrote. But her letter was returned by the post office, no such person being to be found, according to the address. The embarrassment of the moment passed away. Ethel forgot, or rather did not advert to, her friend's lowly destiny in the joy of meeting her again. After a minute or two, also, They had become familiar with the change that time had operated in their youthful appearance, which was not much, and most in Ethel. Her marriage and conversance with the world had changed her into a woman, and endowed her with easy manners and self-possession. Fanny was still a mere girl, tall beyond the middle height, yet her young ingenuous countenance was unaltered, as well as that singular mixture of mildness and independence in her manners which had always characterized her. Her light blue eyes beamed with intelligence, and her smile expressed the complacency and condescension of a superior being. Her beauty was all intellectual, open, sincere, passionless, yet benignant. You approached her without fear of encountering any of the baser qualities of human beings, their hypocrisy or selfishness. Those who have seen the paintings of the calm-visaged, blue-eyed deities of the frescoes of Pompeii may form an idea of the serene beauty of Fanny Durham. When Mrs. Villiers entered, she was reading earnestly, a large dictionary open before her. The book on which she was intent was in Greek characters. "You have not forgotten your old pursuits," said Ethel, smiling. "Say rather I am more wedded to them than ever," she replied, "since more than ever I need them to give light and glory to a dingy world. But you, dear Ethel, if so I may call you, you looked anxious as you entered. You wish to speak to my mother. She is gone to Kennington and will not return tonight. Can I be of any use?" Her mother! How strange! And Mrs. Durham, while she had dilated with pride on her elder daughter, had never mentioned this pearl of price, which was hers also. "Alas, I fear not," replied Ethel. "It is experience I need, experience in things you can know nothing about, nor your mother either, probably, yet she may have heard of such things and know how to advise me." Mrs. Villiers then explained the source of her disquietude. Fanny listened with looks of the kindest sympathy. "Even in such things," she said, "I have had experience. Adversity and I are become very close friends since I last saw you. We are intimate, and I know much good of her, so she is grateful and repays me by prolonging her stay. Be composed. No ill will happen, I trust, to Mr. Villiers. At least you need not be afraid of his being pursued. If the man you have sent be active and faithful, all will be well. I will see these troublesome people tomorrow when they come, and prevent your being annoyed. If Saunders returns early and brings tidings of Mr. Villiers, you will know what his wishes are. You can do nothing more to-night, and there is every probability that all will be well." "Do you really think so?" cried Mrs. Villiers. "Oh, that I had gone with him! Never will I again let him go anywhere without me." Fanny entered into more minute explanations, and succeeded to a great degree in calming her friend. She accompanied her back to her own room, and sat with her long. She entered into the details of her own history, the illness and death of her father, the insulting treatment her mother had met from his family, the kindness of a relation of her own who had assisted them and enabled them to pursue their present mode of life, which procured them a livelihood. Fanny spoke generally of these circumstances, and in a spirit that seemed to disdain that such things were, not because they were degrading in the eyes of others, but because they interfered with the philosophic leisure and enjoyment of nature which she so dearly prized. She thought nothing of privation or the world's impertinence, but much of being immured in the midst of London, and being forced to consider the inglorious necessities of life. Her desire to be useful to her mother induced her often to spend precious time in making the best of things, which she would readily have dispensed with altogether as the easiest as well as the wisest way of freeing herself from their trammels. Her narration interested Ethel, and served to calm her mind. She thought, "Can I not bear those cares with equanimity for Edward's sake, which Fanny regards as so trivial, merely because Plato and Epictetus bid her do so? Will not the good God, who has implanted in her heart So cheerless a consolation bring comfort to mine which has no sorrow but for another's sake? These reflections tranquilized her when she laid her head on her pillow at night. She resigned her being and destiny to a power superior to any earthly authority, with a conviction that its most benign influence would be extended over her. End of Volume 2, Chapter 18. Recording by Linda Johnson. Section 37 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley. Volume 3, Chapter 1. If the dull substance of my flesh were thought, injurious distance should not stop my way, for then, despite of space, I would be brought from limits far remote, where thou dost stay. Shakespeare. The still hours of darkness passed silently away, and morning dawned, when all rose to do the task he set to each who shaped us to his ends and not our own. Ethel had slept peacefully through the livelong night, nor woke till a knock at her door roused her. A rush of fear, a sense of ill, made her heart palpitate as she opened her eyes to the light of day. While she was striving to recall her thoughts and to remember what the evil was with which she was threatened, again the servant tapped at her door to say that Saunders had returned and to deliver the letter he had brought. She looked at her watch. It was past 10 o'clock. She felt glad that it had grown so late and she not disturbed. Yet, as she took the letter brought to her from her husband, all her tremor returned, and she read it with agitation, as if it contained the announcement of her final doom. "You send me disagreeable tidings, my sweet Ethel," wrote Villiers. "I hope unfounded, but caution is necessary. I shall not therefore come to Duke Street. Send me a few lines, by Saunders, to tell me if anything has happened. If what he apprehended has really taken place, you must bear, my love, the separation of a day. You do not understand these things, and will wonder when I tell you that when the clock strikes 12 on Saturday night, the magic spells and potent charms of Saunders' friends cease to have power. At that hour I shall be restored to you. Wait till then, and then we will consult for the future. Have patience, dearest love. You have wedded poverty, hardship, and annoyance, but joined to these is the fondest, the most faithful heart in the world, a heart you deign to prize. So I will not repine at ill fortune. Adieu till this evening, and then, as Belvidera says, remember 12, Saturday morning." After reading these lines, Ethel dressed herself hastily. Fanny Derham had already asked permission to see her, and she found her waiting in her sitting-room. It was an unspeakable comfort to have one as intelligent and kind as Fanny to communicate with during Edward's absence. The soft, pleading eyes of Ethel asked her for comfort and counsel, and in spite of her extreme youth, the benignant and intelligent expression of Fanny's countenance promised both. "I am sorry to say," she said, "that Saunders' prognostics are too true. Such men as he describes have been here this morning. They were tolerably civil, and I convinced them with greater ease than I had hoped that Mr. Villiers was absent from the house, and I assured them that after this visit of theirs he was not likely to return." "And do you really believe that they were—" Ethel faltered. "Bailiffs? Assuredly," replied Fanny. "They told me that they had the power to search the house, but if they were strong, they were also merciful. And now what do you do? Saunders tells me he's waiting to take back a letter to Mr. Villiers at the London coffee-house. Write quickly while I make your breakfast." Ethel gladly obeyed. She wrote a few words to her husband. That it was already Saturday cheered her. 12 at night would soon come. After her note was dispatched, she addressed Fanny. "What trouble I give!" she said. "What will your mother think of such degrading proceedings?" "My mother," said Fanny, "is the kindest-hearted woman in the world. We have never exactly suffered this disaster, but we are in a rank of life which causes us to be brought into contact with such among our friends and relations, and she is familiar with trouble in almost all shapes. You are a great favourite of hers, and now that she can claim a sort of acquaintance, she will be heart and soul your friend." "It is odd," observed Ethel, "that she never mentioned you to me. Had the name of Fanny been mentioned, I should have recollected who Mrs. Durham was." "Perhaps not," said Fanny. "It would have required a great effort of the imagination to have fancied Mrs. Durham the wife of my father. You never knew him, but Lord Lodore made you familiar with his qualities, the most shrinking susceptibility to the world's scorn, joined to the most entire abstraction from all that is vulgar. A morbid sensibility and delicate health placed him in glaring contrast with my mother. They never in the least assimilated, and her character has gained in excellence since his loss. Before, she was fretted and galled by his finer feelings. Now she can be good in her own way. Nothing reminds her of his exalted sentiments except myself, and she is willing enough to forget me." "And you do not repine?" asked her friend. "I do not. She is happy in and with Sarah. I should spoil their notions of comfort did I mingle with them. They would torture and destroy me did they interfere with me. I lost my guide, preserver, my guardian angel when my father died. Nothing remains but the philosophy which he taught me, the disdain of low-thoughted care which he sedulously cultivated. This joined to my cherished independence, which my disposition renders necessary to me." "And thus you foster sorrow and waste your life in vain regrets?" "Pardon me, I do not waste my life," replied Fanny with her sunny smile. "Nor am I unhappy, far otherwise. An ardent thirst for knowledge is as the air I breathe, and the acquisition of it is pure and unalloyed happiness. I aspire to be useful to my fellow creatures, but that is a consideration for the future, when fortune shall smile on me. Now I have but one passion. It swallows up every other. It dwells with my darling books, and is fed by the treasures of beauty and wisdom which they contain." Ethel could not understand. Fanny continued. "I aspire to be useful. Sometimes I think I am. Once I know I was. I was my father's almoner. We lived in a district where there was a great deal of distress and a great deal of oppression. We had no money to give, but I soon found that determination and earnestness will do much. It was my father's lesson that I should never fear anything but myself. He taught me to penetrate, to anatomize, to purify my motives, but once assured of my own integrity, to be afraid of nothing. Words have more power than any one can guess. It is by words that the world's great fight, now in these civilized times, is carried on. I never hesitated to use them when I fought any battle for the miserable and oppressed. People are so afraid to speak. It would seem as if half our fellow creatures were born with deficient organs. Like parrots, they can repeat a lesson, but their voice fails them when that alone is wanting to make the tyrant quail." As Fanny spoke, her blue eyes brightened and a smile irradiated her face. These were all the tokens of enthusiasm she displayed, yet her words moved Ethel strangely, and she looked on her with wonder as a superior being. Her youth gave grace to her sentiments and were an assurance of their sincerity. She continued, "I am becoming flighty, as my mother calls it, but as I spoke many scenes of cottage distress passed through my memory when, holding my father's hand, I witnessed his endeavors to relieve the poor. That is all over now, he is gone, and I have but one consolation, that of endeavoring to render myself worthy to rejoin him in a better world. It is this hope that impels me continually, and without any flagging of spirit, to cultivate my understanding and to refine it. Oh, what has this life to give, as worldlings describe it, worth one of those glorious emotions which raise me from this petty sphere into the sunbright regions of mind which my Father inhabits? I am rewarded even here by the elevated feelings which the authors, whom I love so passionately, inspire, while I converse each day with Plato and Cicero and Epictetus. The world as it is passes from before me like a vain shadow." These enthusiastic words were spoken with so calm a manner and in so equable a voice that there seemed nothing strange nor exaggerated in them. It is vanity and affectation that shock, or any manifestation of feeling not in accordance with the real character. But while we follow our natural bent, and only speak that which our minds spontaneously inspire, there is a harmony which, however novel, is never grating. Fanny Derham spoke of things which, to use her own expression, were to her as the air she breathed, and the simplicity of her manner entirely obviated the wonder which the energy of her expressions might occasion. Such a woman as Fanny was more made to be loved by her own sex than by the opposite one. Superiority of intellect, joined to acquisitions beyond those usual even to men, and both announced with frankness, though without pretension, forms a kind of anomaly little in accord with masculine taste. Fanny could not be the rival of women, and therefore all her merits were appreciated by them. They love to look up to a superior being, to rest on a firmer support than their own minds can afford, and they are glad to find such in one of their own sex, and thus destitute of those dangers which usually attend any services conferred by men. From talk like this they diverged to subjects nearer to the heart of Ethel. They spoke of Lord Lodore, and her father's name soothed her agitation even more than the consolatory arguments of her friend. She remembered how often he had talked of the trials to which the constancy of her temper and the truth of her affection might be put, and she felt her courage rise to encounter those now before her without discontent, or rather with that cheerful fortitude which sheds grace over the rugged form of adversity. End of Volume 3, Chapter 1. Recording by Linda Johnson. Section 38 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley, Volume 3, Chapter 2. Marian. Could you so long be absent? Robin. What, a week? Was that so long? Marian. How long are lovers' weeks? Do you think, Robin, when they are asunder? Are they not prisoners' years? Ben Jonson. The day passed on more lightly than Ethel could have hoped. Much of it, indeed, was gone before she opened her eyes to greet it. Night soon closed in, and she busied herself with arrangements for the welcome of her husband. Fanny loved solitude too well herself not to believe that others shared her taste. She retired, therefore, when evening commenced. No sooner was Ethel alone than every image except Edward's passed out of her mind. Her heart was bursting with affection. Every other idea and thought, to use a chemical expression, was held in solution by that powerful feeling which mingled and united with every particle of her soul. She could not write nor read. If she attempted, before she had finished the shortest sentence, she found that her understanding was wandering, and she reread it with no better success. It was as if a spring, a gush from the fountain of love, poured itself in, bearing away every object which she strove to throw upon the stream of thought, till its own sweet waters alone filled the channel through which it flowed. She gave herself up to the bewildering influence, and almost forgot to count the hours till Edward's expected arrival. At last it was 10 o'clock. and then the sting of impatience and uncertainty was felt. It appeared to her as if a whole age had passed since she had seen or heard of him, as if countless events and incalculable changes might have taken place. She read again and again his note, to assure herself that she might really expect him. The minutes meanwhile stood still, or were told heavily by the distinct beating of her heart. The east wind bore to her ear the sound of the quarters of hours as they chimed from various churches. At length 11, 11:30, was past, and the hand of her watch began to climb slowly upwards toward the zenith which she desired so ardently that it should reach. She gazed on the dial plate till she fancied that the pointers did not move. She placed her hands before her eyes resolutely, and would not look for a long, long time. 3 minutes had not been travelled over when again she viewed it. She tried to count her pulse as a measurement of time. Her trembling fingers refused to press the fluttering artery. At length another quarter of an hour elapsed, and then the succeeding one hurried on more speedily. Clock after clock struck. They mingled their various tones as the hour of 12 was tolled throughout London. It seemed as if they would never end. Silence came at last, a brief silence, succeeded by a firm, quick step in the street below, and a knock at the door. "Is he not too soon?" poor fearful Ethel asked herself. But no, and in a moment after he was with her, safe in her glad embrace. Perhaps of the two, Villiers showed himself the most enraptured at this meeting. He gazed on his sweet wife, followed every motion, and hung upon her voice with all the delight of an exile restored to his long-lost home. "What a transporting change," he said, "to find myself with you, to see you in the same room with me, to know again that, lovely and dear as you are, that you are mine, that I am again myself, not the miserable dog that has been wandering about all day, a body without a soul. For a few short hours, at least, Ethel will call me hers." "Indeed, indeed, love," she replied, "we will not be separated again." "We will not even think about that to-night," said Villiers. "The future is dark and blank, the present as radiant as your own sweet self can make it." On the following day, and the following day did come in spite of Ethel's wishes, which would have held back the progress of time, it came and passed away, hour after hour stealing along, till it dwindled to a mere point. On the following day they consulted earnestly on what was to be done. Villiers was greatly averse to Ethel's leaving her present abode, where everyone was so very kind and attentive to her, and he was sanguine in his hopes of obtaining in the course of the week just commenced a sum sufficient to carry them to Paris or Brussels, where they could remain till his affairs were finally arranged and the payment of his debts regulated in a way to satisfy his creditors. 1 week of absence, Villiers used all his persuasion to induce Ethel to submit to it. "Where you can be, I can be also," was her answer, and she listened unconvinced to the detail of the inconveniences which Villiers pointed out. At last he almost got angry. "I could call you unkind, Ethel," he said, "not to yield to me." "I will yield to you," said Ethel, "but you are wrong to ask me." "Never mind that," replied her husband. "Do concede this point, dearest, if not because it is best that you should, then because I wish it and ask it of you. You say that your first desire is to make me happy, and you pain me exceedingly by your, I had almost said, perverseness." Thus, not convinced but obedient, Ethel agreed to allow him to depart alone. She bargained that she should be permitted to come each day in a hackney coach to a place where he might meet her, and they could spend an hour or two together. Edward did not like this plan at all, but there was no remedy. "You are at least resolved," he said, "to spur my endeavours. I will not rest day or night till I am enabled to get away from this vast dungeon. The hours stole on. Even Edward's buoyant spirits could not bear up against the sadness of watching the fleeting moments till the one should come which must separate him from his wife. "This nice dear room," he said, "I am sure I beg its pardon for having despised it so much formerly. It is not as lofty as a church, nor as grand as a palace, but it is very snug, and now you are in it, I discern even elegance in its exceedingly queer tables and chairs. When our carriage broke down on the Apennines, how glad we should have been if a room like this had risen, like an exhalation, for our shelter. Do you remember the barn of a place we got into there, and our droll bed of the leaves of Indian corn, which crackled all night long and awoke us 20 times with the fear of robbers? Then, indeed, 12 o'clock was not to separate us." As he said this he sighed. The hour of 11 was indicated by Ethel's watch, and still he lingered. But she grew frightened for him and forced him to go away, while he besought the delay of but a few minutes. Ethel exerted herself to endure as well as she could the separation of the ensuing week. She was not of a repining disposition, yet she found it very hard to bear. The discomfort to which Villiers was exposed annoyed her, and the idea that she was not permitted to alleviate it added to her painful feelings. In her prospect of life, every evil was neutralized when shared. Now they were doubled, because the pain of absence from each other was superadded. She did not yield to her husband, in her opinion that this was wrong. She was willing to go anywhere with him, and where he was she also could be. There could be no degradation in a wife waiting on the fallen fortunes of her husband. No debasement can arise from any services dictated by love. It is despicable to submit to hardship for unworthy and worldly objects, but everything that is suffered for the sake of affection is hallowed by the disinterested sentiment, and affords triumph and delight to the willing victim. Sometimes she tried in speech or on paper to express these feelings, and so by the force of irresistible reasoning to persuade Edward to permit her to join him, but all argument was weak. There was something beyond that no words could express, which was stronger than any reason in her heart. Who can express the power of faithful and single-hearted love? As well attempt to define the laws of life, which occasions a continuity of feeling from the brain to the extremity of the frame, as try to explain how love can so unite two souls as to make each feel maimed and half alive while divided. A powerful impulse was perpetually urging Ethel to go, to place herself near Villiers, to refuse to depart. It was with the most violent struggles that she overcame the instigation. She could never forget herself while away from him, or find the slightest alleviation to her disquietude except while conversing with Fanny Durham, or rather while drawing her out and listening to her and wondering at a mechanism of mind so different from her own. Each had been the favorite daughter of men of superior qualities of mind. They had been educated by their several fathers with the most sedulous care, and nothing could be more opposite than the result, except that, indeed, both made duty the master motive of their actions. Ethel had received, so to speak, a sexual education. Lord Lodore had formed his ideal of what a woman ought to be, of what he had wished to find his wife, and sought to mold his daughter accordingly. Mr. Durham contemplated the duties and objects befitting an immortal soul, and had educated his child for the performance of them. The one fashioned his offspring to be the wife of a frail human being, and instructed her to be yielding and to make it her duty to devote herself to his happiness and to obey his will. The other sought to guard his from all weakness, to make her complete in herself, and to render her independent and self-sufficing. Born to poverty as Fanny was, it was thus only that she could find happiness in rising above her sphere. And besides, a sense of pride surviving his sense of injury caused him to wish that his child should set her heart on higher things than the distinctions and advantages of riches or rank, so that if ever brought into collision with his own family, she could look down with calm superiority on the low ambition of the wealthy. While Ethel made it her happiness and duty to give herself away with unreserved prodigality to him whom she thought had every claim to her entire devotion, Fanny zealously guarded her individuality, and would have scorned herself could she have been brought to place the treasures of her soul at the disposal of any power except those moral laws which it was her earnest endeavour never to transgress. Religion, reason, and justice, these were the landmarks of her life. She was kind-hearted, generous, and true. So also was Ethel, but the one was guided by the tenderness of her heart, while the other consulted her understanding, and would have died rather than have acted contrary to its dictates. To guard Ethel from every contamination, Lord Lodore had secluded her from all society, and forestalled every circumstance that might bring her into conjunction with her fellow creatures. He was equally careful to prevent her fostering any pride except that of sex, and never spoke to her as if she were of an elevated rank. And the communication, however small, which she necessarily had with the Americans, made such ideas foreign to her mind. But she was exceedingly shy, tremblingly alive to the slightest repulse, and never perfectly fearless, morally so, that is, except when under the shelter of another's care. Fanny's first principle was, that what she ought to do, that she could do, without hesitation or regard for obstacles. She had something quixotic in her nature, or rather she would have had if a clear head and some experience, even young as she was, had not stood in the way of her making any glaring mistakes, so that her enterprises were never ridiculous, and being usually successful could not be called extravagant. For herself she needed but her liberty and her books. For others she had her time, her thoughts, her decided and resolute modes of action, all at their command, whenever she was convinced that they had a just claim upon them. It was singular that the resolute and unshrinking Fanny should be the daughter of Francis Durham, and the timid, retiring Ethel of his bold and daring protector. But this is no uncommon case. We feel the evil results of our own faults, and endeavour to guard our children from them, forgetful that the opposite extreme has also its peculiar dangers. Lord Lodore attributed his early misfortunes to the too great freedom he had enjoyed, or rather to the unlimited scope given to his will from his birth. Mr. Durham saw the unhappiness that had sprung from his own yielding and undecided disposition. The one brought up his child to dependence, the other taught his to disdain every support except the applause of her own conscience. Lodore fostered all the sensibility, all the softness of Ethel's feminine and delicate nature, while Fanny's father strove to harden and confirm a character in itself singularly steadfast and upright. In spite of the great contrast thus exhibited between Ethel and Fanny, one quality created a good deal of similarity between them. There was in both a total absence of every factitious sentiment. They acted from their own hearts, from their own sense of right, without the intervention of worldly considerations. A feeling of duty ruled all their actions, and however excellent a person's dispositions may be, it yet requires considerable elevation of character never to deviate from the strict line of honor and integrity. Fanny's society a little relieved Ethel's solitude, yet that did not weigh on her, and had she not been the child of her father's earliest friend and the companion of past days, she would have been disinclined at this period to cultivate an intimacy with her. She needed no companion except the thought of Edward, which was never absent from her mind. But amidst all her affection for her husband, which gained strength, and as it were covered each day a larger portion of her being, any one associated with the name of Lodore, of her beloved father, had a magic power to call forth her warmest feelings of interest. Both ladies repeated to each other what they had heard from their several parents. Mr. Derham had, among his many lessons of usefulness, descanted on the generosity and boldness of Fitzhenry, as offering an example to be followed; and during the last months of Lodore's life he had recurred with passionate fondness to the memory of his early years, and painted in glowing colours the delicacy of feeling, the deep sense of gratitude, and the latent but fervid enthusiasm which adorned the character of Francis Derham. End of Volume 3, Chapter 2. Recording by Linda Johnson. Section 39 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley, Volume 3, Chapter 3. It does much trouble me to live without you. Our loves and loving souls have been so used to one household in us. Beaumont and Fletcher. The week passed on. It was the month of January and very cold. A black frost bound up everything with ice, and the piercing air congealed the very blood. Each day Ethel went to see her husband. Each day she had to encounter Mrs. Derham's entreaties not to go, and the reproaches of Villiers for coming. Both were unavailing to prevent the daily pilgrimage. Mrs. Derham sighed heavily when she saw her enter the rickety hackney coach, whose damp lining, gaping windows, and miserable straw made it a cold bed for catarrh, a very temple for the spirit of winter. Villiers each day besought her to have horses put to their chariot, if she must come, but Ethel remembered all he had ever said of expense, and his prognostications of how ill she would be able to endure the petty, yet galling annoyances of poverty, and she resolved to prove that she could cheerfully bear everything except separation from him. With this laudable motive to incite her, she tasked her strength too far. She kept up her spirits to meet him with a cheerful countenance, and she contrived to conceal the sufferings she endured while they were together. They got out and walked now and then, and this tended to keep up the vital warmth. Their course was generally taken over Blackfriars Bridge, and it was on their return across the river, on whose surface large masses of ice floated, while a bitter northeast wind swept up, bearing on its blasts the unthawed breath of the German Ocean, that she felt the cold enter her heart and make her head feel dizzy. Still she could smile and ask Villiers why he objected to her taking an exercise even necessary for her health, and repeat again and again that, bred in America, an English winter was but a faint reflex of what she had encountered there, and insist upon being permitted to come on the following day. These were precious moments in her eyes, worth all the pain they occasioned, well worth the struggle she made for the repetition. Edward's endearing attentions, the knowledge she had that she was loved, the swelling and earnest affection that warmed her own heart, hallowed these hard-earned minutes, and gave her the sweet pleasure of knowing that she demonstrated, in some slight degree, the profound and all-engrossing attachment which pervaded her entire being. They parted, and often she arrived nearly senseless at Duke Street, and once or twice fainted on entering the warm room. But it was not pain she felt then. The emotions of the soul conquered the sensation of her body, and pleasure, the intense pleasure of affection, was predominant through all. Sunday came again, and brought Villiers to her home. Mrs. Derham took the opportunity to represent to him the injury that Ethel was doing herself, and begged him, as he cared for her health, to forbid her exposing herself to the inclement weather. "You hear this, Ethel," said Villiers, "and yet you are obstinate. Is this right? What can I urge? What can I do to prevent this wrong-headed pertinacity?" "You use such very hard words," replied Ethel, smiling, "that you frighten me into believing myself criminal. But so far am I from conceding that you only give me courage to say that I cannot any longer endure the sad and separate life we lead. It must be changed, dearest, we must be together." Villiers was pacing the room impatiently. With an exclamation almost approaching to anger, he stopped before his wife to remonstrate and to reproach. But as he gazed upon her upturned face, fixed so beseechingly and fondly on him, he fancied that he saw the hues of ill health stealing across her cheeks, and thinness displacing the roundness of her form. A strange emotion flashed across him, a new fear, too terrible even to be acknowledged to himself, which passed, like the shadow of a storm, across his anticipations and filled him with inquietude. His reprehension was changed to a caress, as he said, "You are right, my love, quite right. We must not live thus. You are unable to take care of yourself, and I am very wrong to give up my dearest privilege of watching day and night over the welfare of my only treasure. We will be together, Ethel. If the worst come, it cannot be very bad while we are true to each other." Tears filled the poor girl's eyes, tears of joy and tenderness, at hearing Edward echo the sentiments she cherished as the most sacred in the world. For a few minutes they forgot everything in the affectionate kiss, which ratified as it were this new law, and then Edward considered how best he could carry it into effect. "Gayland," he said, he was his solicitor, "has appointed to see me on Thursday morning, and has good hopes of definitively arranging the conditions for the loan of the £500, which is to enable us to wait for better things. On Thursday evening we will leave town. We will go to some pretty country inn, to wait till I have signed these papers, and trust to Providence that no ill will arise. We must not be more than 15 or 20 miles from London, so that when I am obliged to go up I can return again in a few hours. Tell me, sweet, does this scheme please you?" Ethel expressed her warmest gratitude, and then Villiers insinuated his condition, that she should not come to see him in the interval, but remain taking care of herself till on Thursday afternoon at 6 o'clock she came, with their chariot, to the northern side of St. Paul's churchyard, where he would immediately join her. They might write meanwhile. He promised letters as long as if they were to go to India, and soothed her annoyance with every expression of thankfulness at her giving up this point. She did give it up, with all the readiness she could muster, and this increased as he dwelt upon the enjoyment they would share in exchanging foggy, smoky London for the ever-pleasing aspect of nature which, even during frost and snow, possesses her own charms, her own wonders, and can gratify our senses by 1,000 forms of beauty which have no existence in a dingy metropolis. When the evening hour came for the young pair to separate, their hearts were cheered by the near prospect of reunion, and a belief that the, to them, trivial privations of poverty were the only ones they would have to endure. The thrill of fear which had crossed the mind of Villiers as to the health and preservation of his wife had served to dissipate the lingering sense of shame and degradation inspired by the penury of their situation. He felt that there was something better than wealth, and the attendance of his fellow creatures, something worse than poverty, and the world's scorn. Within the fragile form of Ethel there beat a heart of more worth than a king's ransom, and its pulsations were ruled by him. To lose her! What would all that earth can afford of power or splendor appear without her? He pressed her to his bosom, and knew that his arms encircled all life's worth for him. Never again could he forget the deep-felt appreciation of her value, which then took root in his mind, while she, become conscious, by force of sympathy, of the kind of revolution that was made in his sentiments, felt that the foundations of her life grew strong, and that her hopes in this world became steadfast and enduring. Before, a wall of separation, however slight, had divided them. They had followed a system of conduct independent of each other, and passed their censure upon the ideas of either. This was over now. They were one sense of right, one feeling of happiness, and when they parted that night, each felt that they truly possessed the other, and that by mingling every hope and wish, they had confirmed the marriage of their hearts. End of Volume 3, Chapter 3. Recording by Linda Johnson. Section 40 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley. Volume 3, Chapter 4. Think but whither now you can go, what you can do to live, how near you have barred all ports to your own succor, except this one that here I open, love. Beaumont and Fletcher. The most pleasing thoughts shed their balmy influence on Ethel's repose that night. Edward's scheme of a country inn, where the very freedom would make them more entirely dependent upon each other, was absolutely enchanting. Where we establish ourselves and look forward to the passage of a long interval of time, we form ties with, and assume duties towards, many of our fellow creatures, each of which must diminish the singleness of the soul's devotion towards the selected one. No doubt this is the fitting position for human beings to place themselves in, as affording a greater scope for utility. But for a brief space to have no occupation but that of contributing to the happiness of him to whom her life was consecrated appeared to Ethel a very heaven upon earth. It was not that she was narrow-hearted. So much affection demands a spacious mansion for its abode. But in their present position of struggle and difficulty, there was no possibility of extending her sphere of benevolence, and she gladly concentrated her endeavors in the one object whose happiness was in her hands. All night, even in sleep, a peculiar sense of calm enjoyment soothed the mind of Ethel, and she awoke in the morning with buoyant spirits and a soul all alive to its own pleasurable existence. She sat at her little solitary breakfast table, musing with still renewed delight upon the prospect opened before her, when suddenly she was startled by the vision of an empty purse. What could Villiers intend? She felt assured that his stock was very nearly exhausted, and for herself 2 sovereigns, which were not sufficient to meet the demands of the last week, was all that she possessed. She tried to recollect if Edward had said anything that denoted any expectation of receiving money. On the contrary, diving into the recesses of her memory, she called to mind that he had said, "We shall receive your poor little dividend of £100 in less than a fortnight, so we shall be able to live, even if Gayland should delay getting the other money. I suppose we have enough to get on till then." He had said this inquiringly, and she knew that she had made a sign of assent, though at the time she had no thought of the real purport of his question or of her answer. What was to be done? The obvious consequence of her reflections was at once to destroy the cherished scheme of going out of town with Villiers. This was a misfortune too great to bear, and she at last decided upon having again recourse to her aunt. Unused to every money transaction, she had not that terror of obligation nor dislike of asking which is so necessary to preserve our independence and even our sense of justice through life. Money had always been placed like counters in her hand. She had never known whence it came, and until her marriage she had never disposed of more than very small sums. Subsequently Villiers had been the director of their expenses. This was the faulty part of her father's system of education. But Lodore's domestic habits were for a great part founded on experience in foreign countries, and he forgot that an English wife is usually the cashier, the sole controller of the disbursements of her family. It seemed as easy a thing for Ethel to ask for money from Mrs. Fitzhenry as she knew it would be easy for her to give. In compliance, however, with Villiers' notions, she limited her request to £10, and tried to word her letters so as to create no suspicion in her aunt's mind with regard to their resources. This task achieved, she dismissed every annoying thought, and when Fanny came to express her hope that, bleak and snowy as was the day, she did not intend to make her accustomed pilgrimage, with a countenance beaming with delight, she dilated on their plan, and spoke as if on the much-desired Thursday the gates of Elysium were to be thrown open for her. There would have appeared something childish in her gladness to the abstracted and philosophic mind of Fanny, but that the real evils of her situation, and the fortitude, touching in its unconscious simplicity, with which she encountered them, commanded respect. Ethel, as well as her friend, was elevated above the commonplace of life. She also fostered a state of mind, lofty and magnificent, fitted rather to command than to obey, not only suffering patiently, but even making light of all human cares, a grand and dignified self-possession which fears nothing, yields to no one, and remains forever unvanquished. When Fanny, in one of their conversations, while describing the uses of philosophy, had translated this eulogium of its effects from Cicero, Ethel had exclaimed, "This is love. It is love alone that divides us from sordid earth-born thoughts, and causes us to walk alone, girt by its own beauty and power." Fanny smiled. Yet, while she saw slavery rather than a proud independence in the creed of Ethel, she admired the warmth of heart which could endow with so much brilliancy a state of privation and solitude. At the present moment, when Mrs. Villiers was rapturously announcing their scheme for leaving London, an expression of pain mantled over Fanny's features. Her clear blue eyes became suffused. A large tear gathered on her lashes. "What is the matter?" asked Ethel anxiously. "That I am a fool. But pardon me, for the folly is already passed away. For the first time you have made it hard for me to keep my soul firm in its own single existence. I have been debarred from all intercourse with those whose ideas rise above the soil on which they tread, except in my dear books, and I thought I should never be attached to anything but them. Yet do not think me selfish. Mr. Villiers is quite right. It is much better that you should not be apart. I am delighted with his plan." "Away or near, dear Fanny," said Ethel, in a caressing tone, "I never can forget your kindness, never cease to feel the warmest friendship for you. Remember, our fathers were friends, and their children ought to inherit the same faithful attachment." Fanny smiled faintly. "You must not seduce me from my resolves," she said. "I know my fate in this world, and I am determined to be true to myself to the end. Yet I am not ungrateful to you, even while I declare that I shall do my best to forget this brief interval, during which I have no longer, like Demogorgon, lived alone in my own world, but become aware that there are ties of sympathy between me and my fellow creatures, in whose existence I did not believe before." Fanny's language, drawn from her books, not because she tried to imitate, but because, conversing perpetually with them, it was natural that she should adopt their style, was always energetic and imaginative, but her quiet manner destroyed every idea of exaggeration of sentiment. It was necessary to hear her soft and low, but very distinct voice utter her lofty sentiments, to be conscious that the calm of deep waters was the element in which she dwelt, not the fretful breakers that spend themselves in sound. The day seemed rather long to Ethel, who counted the hours until Thursday. Gladly she laid her head on the pillow at night and bade adieu to the foregone hours. The first thing that awoke her in the morning was the postman's knock. It brought, as she had been promised, a long, long letter from Edward. He had never before written with so much affection or with such an overflowing of tenderness that made her the centre of his world, the calm fair lake to receive into its bosom the streams of thought and feeling which flowed from him, and yet which, after all, had their primal source in her. "I am a very happy girl," thought Ethel, as she kissed the beloved papers and gazed on them in ecstasy. "More happy than I thought it was ever given us to be in this world." She rose and began to dress. She delayed reading more than a line or two, that she might enjoy her dearest pleasure for a longer time. Then again, unable to control her impatience, she sat half-dressed and finished all, and was beginning anew, when there was a tap at her door. It was Fanny. She looked disturbed and anxious, and Ethel's fears were in a moment awake. "Something annoying has occurred," she said. "Yet I do not think that there is anything to dread, though there is a danger to prevent." "Speak quickly," cried Ethel. "Do not keep me in suspense." "Be calm. It is nothing sudden. It is only a repetition of the old story. A boy has just been here, a boy you gave a sovereign to. Do you remember? The night of your arrival. It seems that he has vowed himself to your service ever since. Those two odious men who were here once are often at his master's place, an alehouse, you know. Well, yesterday night he overheard them saying that Mr. Villiers's resort at the London coffee-house was discovered, or at least suspected, and that a writ was to be taken out against him in the city." "What does that mean?" cried Ethel. "That Mr. Villiers will probably be arrested today or tomorrow if he remains where he is." "I will go directly to him," cried Ethel. "We must leave town at once. God grant that I am not too late." Seeing her extreme agitation, Fanny remained with her, forced her to take some breakfast, and then, fearing that if anything had really taken place she would be quite bewildered, asked her permission to accompany her. "Will you indeed come with me?" Ethel exclaimed. "How dear, how good you are!" "Oh yes, do come. I can never go through it all alone. I shall die if I do not find him." A hackney coach had been called, and they hastened with what speed they might to their destination. A kind of panic seized upon Ethel. A tremor shook her limbs, so that when they at last stopped she was unable to speak. Fanny was about to ask for Mr. Villiers when an exclamation of joy from Ethel stopped her. Edward had seen them and was at the coach door. The snow lay thick around on the roofs of the houses, and on every atom of vantage ground it could obtain. It was then snowing, and as the chilly fleece dropped through or was driven about in the dark atmosphere, it spread a most disconsolate appearance over everything, and nothing could look more dreary than poor Ethel's jumbling vehicle, with its drooping animals and the half-frozen driver. Villiers had made up his mind that he should never be mortified by seeing her again in this sort of equipage, and he hurried down, the words of reproach already on his lips. "Is this your promise?" he asked. "Yes, dearest, it is. Come in, there is danger here. Come in, we must go directly." Seeing Fanny, Villiers became aware that there was some absolute cause for their journey, so he obeyed and quickly heard the danger that threatened him. "It would have been better," he said, "that you had come in the carriage and that we had instantly left town." "Impossible!" cried Ethel. "Till tomorrow, that is quite impossible. We have no money until tomorrow." "Well, my love, since it is so, we must arrange as well as we can. Do you return home immediately. This cold will kill you. I will take care of myself, and you can come for me on Thursday evening as we proposed." "Do not ask it of me, Edward," said Ethel. "I cannot leave you. I could never live through these 2 days away from you. You must not desire it. You will kill me." Edward kissed her pale cheek. "You tremble," he said. "How violently you tremble! Good God, what can we do? What would you have me do?" anything so that we remain together. It is of so little consequence where we pass the next 24 hours, so that we are together. There are many hotels in town. I must not venture to any of these, and then to take you in this miserable manner, without servants or anything to command attendance. But you shall have your own way. Having deprived you of every other luxury, at least you shall have your will, which, you know, compensates for everything with your obstinate sex." Ethel smiled, rejoicing to find him in so good and accommodating a humour. "Yes, pretty one," he continued, marking her feelings, "you shall be as wretched and uncomfortable as your heart can desire. We will play the incognito in such a style that, if our adventures were printed, they would compete with those of Don Quixote and the fair Dulcinea. But Miss Derham must not be admitted into our vagabondizing. We will not detain her." "Yet she must know whither we are going, to bring us the letters that will confer freedom on us." Villiers wrote hastily an address on a card. "You will find us there," he said. "Do not mention names when you come. We shall remain, I suppose, till Thursday." "But we shall see you sometime tomorrow, dear Fanny?" asked Ethel. Already she looked bright and happy. She esteemed herself fortunate to have gained so easily a point she had feared she must struggle for, or perhaps give up altogether. Fanny left them, and the coachman, having received his directions, drove slowly on through the deep snow which fell thickly on the road, while they, nestling close to each other, were so engrossed by the gladness of reunion that had Cinderella's godmother transmuted their crazy vehicle for a golden coach redolent of the perfumes of fairyland, they had scarcely been aware of the change. Their own hearts formed a more real fairyland, which accompanied them whithersoever they went, and could as easily spread its enchantments over the shattered machine in which they now jumbled along as amidst the cloth of gold and marbles of an Eastern palace. End of Volume 3, Chapter 4. Recording by Linda Johnson. Section 41 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley. Volume 3, Chapter 5. Few people know how little is necessary to live. What is called or thought hardship is nothing. One unhappy feeling is worse than 1,000 years of it. Lord Edward Fitzgerald. Uncertain what to do, Villiers had hastily determined that they should take up their abode at a little inn near Brixton to wait till Thursday. He did not know the place except by having passed it, and observed a smart landlady at the door, so he trusted that it would be neat and clean. There was nothing imposing in the appearance of the young pair and their hackney coach; accordingly there was no bustling civility displayed to receive them. However, when the fire was once lighted, the old-fashioned sofa drawn near, and dinner ordered, they sat together and felt very happy, outcasts though they were, wanderers from civilized existence, shut out through poverty from the refinements and gilt elegancies of life. One only cloud there was, when Villiers asked his wife an explanation about their resources, and inquired whence she expected to receive money on the following day. Ethel explained. Villiers looked disturbed. There was something almost of anger in his voice when he said, "And so, Ethel, you feel no compunction in acting in exact opposition to my wishes, my principles, my resolves?" "But, dear Edward, what can principles have to do with borrowing a few pounds from dear good Aunt Bessie? Besides, we can repay her." "Be assured that we will," replied Villiers, "and you will never again, I trust, behave so unjustly by me. There are certain things in which we must judge and act for ourselves, and the question of money transactions is one. I may suffer, and you, alas, may also through poverty, though you have taken pains to persuade me that you do not feel the struggles which, for your sake chiefly, embitter my existence. Yet they are nothing in comparison with the loss of my independence, the sense of obligation, the knowledge that my kind friends can talk over my affairs, take me to task, and call me a burthen to them. Why am I as I am? I have friends and connections who would readily assist me at this extremity if I asked it, and I might turn their kind feelings into sterling gold if I would. But I have no desire to work this transmutation. I prefer their friendship." "Do you mean," inquired his wife, "that your friends would not love you the better for having been of service to you?" "If they could serve me without annoyance to themselves, they might. But high in rank and wealthy as many of my relations are, there is not one among them, at least of those to whom I could have recourse, who do not dispose of their resources to the uttermost shilling in their own way. I then come to interfere with and to disarrange their plans. At first this might not be much, but presently they would weigh me against the gold I needed, and it might happen that my scale would kick the beam. I speak for myself, not for others. I may be too proud, too sensitive, but so I am. Ever since I knew what pecuniary obligations were, I resolved to lay under such to no man, and this resolve was stronger than my love for you. Judge, therefore, of its force, and the violence you do me, when you would oblige me to act against it. Did I begin to borrow, a train of thoughts would enter the lender's mind, the consciousness of which would haunt me like a crime. My actions would be scanned. I should be blamed for this, rebuked for that. Even your name, my Ethel, which I would place like a star in the sky, far above their mathematical measurements, would become stale in their mouths, and the propriety of our marriage canvassed. Could you bear that?" "I yield to all you say," she answered. "Yet this is strange morality. Are generosity, benevolence, and gratitude to be exploded among us? Is justice, which orders that the rich give of his superfluity to the poor, to be banished from the world?" "You are eloquent," said Villiers, "but, my little wild American, this is philosophy for the backwoods only. We have got beyond the primeval simplicity of barter and exchange among gentlemen, and it is such if I give gratitude in return for £50, by and by my fellow trader may grumble at the bargain. All this will become very clear to you hereafter, I fear, when knowledge of the world teaches you what sordid knaves we all are. It is to prevent your learning this lesson in a painful way that I guard you so jealously from making a wrong step at this crisis." "You speak of dreams," said Ethel, "as if dear Aunt Bessie would feel anything but pleasure in sending her mite to her own dear niece." "I have told you what I wish," replied her husband. "My honour is in your hands, and I implore you on this point to preserve it in the way I desire. There is but one relationship that authorizes anything like community of goods. It is that of parent and child. But we are orphans, dearest, stepchildren, who are not permitted to foster our filial sentiments. My father is unworthy of his name. The animal who destroys its offspring at its birth is merciful in comparison with him. Had he cast me off at once, I should have hardened my hands with labor and earned my daily bread. But I was trained to high-born necessities, and have all the wide wants and narrow powers of the heir of wealth. But let us dismiss this ungrateful subject. I never willingly advert, even in my own mind, to my father's unpaternal conduct. Let us instead fancy, sweet love, that we were born to what we have, that we are cottagers, the children of mechanics, or wanderers in a barbarous country, where money is not, and imagine that this repose, this cheerful fire, this shelter from the pelting snow without, is an unexpected blessing. Strip a man bare to what nature made him, and place him here, and what a hoard of luxury and wealth would not this room contain! In the Illinois, love, few mansions could compete with this." This was speaking in a language which Ethel could easily comprehend. She had several times wished to express this very idea, but she feared to hurt the refined and exclusive feelings of her husband. A splendid dwelling, costly living, and many attendants were with her the adjuncts, not the material, of life. If the stage on which she played her part was to be so decorated, it was well. If otherwise, the change did not merit her attention. Love scoffed at such idle trappings, and could build his tent of canvas and sleep close, nestled in her heart as softly, being only the more lovely and the more true from the absence of every meretricious ornament. This was another of Ethel's happy evenings, when she felt drawn close to him she loved, and found Elysium in the intimate union of their thoughts. The dusky room showed them but half to each other, and the looks of each, beaming with tenderness, drank life from one another's gaze. The soft shadows thrown on their countenances gave a lamp-like lustre to their eyes, in which the purest spirit of affection sat, weaving such unity of sentiment, such strong bonds of attachment, as made all life dwindle to a point, and freighted the passing minute with the hopes and fears of their entire existence. Not much was said, and their words were childish words. Intellette dar loro soli ambedui, which a listener would have judged to be meaningless. But the mystery of love gave a deep sense to each syllable. The hours flew lightly away. There was nothing to interrupt, nothing to disturb. Night came, and the day was at an end, but Ethel looked forward to the next, with faith in its equal felicity, and did not regret the fleet passage of time. They had been asked during the evening if they were going by any early coach on the following morning, and a simple negative was given. On that morning they sat at their breakfast, with some diminution of the sanguine hopes of the previous evening. For morning is the time for action, of looking forward, of expectation, and they must spend this in waiting, cooped up in a little room, overlooking no cheering scene. A high road, thickly covered with snow, on which various vehicles were perpetually passing, was immediately before them. Opposite was a row of mean-looking houses, between which might be distinguished low fields buried in snow, and the dreary, dark-looking sky bending over all added to the forlorn aspect of nature. Villiers was very impatient to get away, yet another day must be passed here, and there was no help. On the breakfast table the waiter had placed the bill of the previous day. It remained unnoticed, and he left it on the table when the things were taken away. "I wonder when Fanny will come," said Ethel. "Perhaps not at all to-day," observed Villiers. "She knows that we intend to remain till to-morrow here, and if your aunt's letter is delayed till then, I see no chance of her coming, nor any use in it." "But Aunt Bessie will not delay. Her answer is certain of arriving this morning." "So you imagine, love. You know little of the various chances that wait upon borrowing." Soon after, unable to bear confinement to the house, uneasy in his thoughts, and desirous a little to dissipate them by exercise, Villiers went out. Ethel, taking a small Shakespeare, which her husband had had with him at the coffee-house, occupied herself by reading, or, turning from the written page to her own thoughts, gave herself up to reverie, dwelling on many an evanescent idea, and reverting delightedly to many scenes which her memory recalled. She was one of those who know the pleasures of solitude when we hold commune alone with the tranquil solemnity of nature. The thought of her father, of the Illinois, and the measureless forest rose before her, and in her ear was the dashing of the stream which flowed near their abode. Her light feet again crossed the prairie, and 1,000 appearances of sky and earth departed forever were retraced in her brain. Would not Edward be happy there, she thought. Why should we not go? We should miss dear Horatio, but what else could we regret that we leave behind? and perhaps he would join us, and then we should be quite happy." And then her fancy pictured her new home and all its delights, till her eyes were suffused with tender feeling as her imagination sketched a variety of scenes: the pleasant labours of cultivation, the rides, the hunting, the boating, all commonplace occurrences, which, attended on by love, were exalted into a perpetual, gorgeous procession of beatified hours. And then again she allowed to herself that Europe or America could contain the same delights. She recollected Italy, and her feelings grew more solemn and blissful as she meditated on the wondrous beauty and changeful but deep interest of that land of memory. Villiers did not return for some hours. He also had indulged in reverie, long drawn but not quite so pleasant as that of his inexperienced wife. The realities of life were kneaded up too entirely with his prospects and schemes for them to assume the fairy hues that adorned Ethel's. He could not see the end to his present struggle for the narrowest independence. Very slender hopes had been held out to him, and thus he was to drag out an embittered existence, spent upon sordid cares, till his father died, an ungrateful idea, from which he turned with a sigh. He walked speedily on account of the cold, and as his blood began to circulate more cheerily in his frame, a change came over the tenor of his thoughts. From the midst of the desolation in which he was lost, a vision of happiness arose that forced itself on his speculations, in spite, as he imagined, of his better reason. The image of an elegant home, here or in Italy, adorned by Ethel, cheered by the presence of friends, unshadowed by any cares, presented itself to his mind with strange distinctness and pertinacity. At no time had Villiers loved so passionately as now. The difficulties of their situation had exalted her who shared them with such cheerful fortitude into an angel of consolation. The pride of man in possessing the affections of this lovely and noble-minded creature was blended with the tenderest desire of protecting and serving her. His heart glowed with honest joy at the reflection that her happiness depended upon him solely, and that he was ready to devote his life to secure it. Was there any action too arduous, any care too minute, to display his gratitude and his perfect affection? As his recollection came back, he found that he was at a considerable distance from her, so he swiftly turned his steps homeward, that was his home where she was, and scarcely felt that he trod earth, as he recollected that each moment carried him nearer, and that he should soon meet the fond gaze of the kindest, sweetest eyes in the world. Thus they met, with a renewed joy, after a short absence, each reaping from their separate meditations a fresh harvest of loving thoughts and interchange of grateful emotion. Great was the pity that such was their situation, that circumstances, all mean and trivial, drew them from their heaven-high elevation to the more sordid cares of this dirty planet. Yet why name it pity? Their pure natures could turn the grovelling substance presented to them to ambrosial food for the sustenance of love. End of Volume 3, Chapter 5. Recording by Linda Johnson. Section 42 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley, Volume 3, Chapter 6. There's a bliss beyond all that the minstrel has told, when two that are linked in one heavenly tie, with heart never changing and brow never cold, love on through all ills, and love on till they die. Lalla Rookh. Villiers had not been returned long when the waiter came in and informed them that his mistress declined serving their dinner till her bill of the morning was paid, and then he left the room. The gentle pair looked at each other and laughed. "We must wait till Fanny comes, I fear," said Ethel, "for my purse is literally empty." "And if Miss Derham should not come?" remarked Villiers. "But she will. She has delayed, but I am perfectly certain that she will come in the course of the day. I do not feel the least doubt about it." To quicken the passage of time, Ethel employed herself in netting a purse, the inutility of which Villiers smilingly remarked, while her husband read to her some of the scenes from Shakespeare's play of Troilus and Cressida. The profound philosophy and intense passion of this drama, adorned by the most magnificent poetry that can even be found in the pages of this prince of poets, caused each to hang attentive and delighted upon their occupation. As it grew dark, Villiers stirred up the fire and still went on, till having with difficulty deciphered the lines, "She was beloved, she loved, she is and doth, but still sweet love is food for fortune's tooth," he closed the book. "It is in vain," he said, "our liberator does not come, and these churls will not give us lights." "It is early yet, dearest," replied Ethel, "not yet 4 o'clock. Would Troilus and Cressida have repined at having been left darkling a few minutes? How much happier we are than all the heroes and heroines that ever lived or were imagined! They grasped at the mere shadow of the thing, whose substance we absolutely possess. Let us know and acknowledge our good fortune. God knows I do, and am beyond words grateful. It is much to be grateful for, sharing the fortunes of a ruined man." "You do not speak as Troilus does," replied Ethel, smiling. "He knew better the worth of love compared with worldly trifles." "You would have me protest, then?" said Villiers. "But, alas! I am as true as truth's simplicity, and simpler than the infancy of truth. So that all I can say is, that you are a very ill-used little girl, to be mated as you are, so buried, with all your loveliness, in this obscurity, so bound, though akin to heaven, to the basest dross of earth." "You are poetical, dearest, and I thank you. For my own part, I am in love with ill luck. I do not think we should have discovered how very dear we are to each other had we sailed for ever on a summer sea." Such talk, a little prolonged, at length dwindled to silence. Edward drew her nearer to him, and as his arm encircled her waist, she placed her sweet head on his bosom, and they remained in silent reverie. He, as with his other hand he played with her shining ringlets and parted them on her fair brow, was disturbed in thought and saddened by a sense of degradation. Not to be able to defend the angelic creature who depended on him from the world's insults galled his soul and embittered even the heart's union that existed between them. She did not think, she did not know of these things. After many minutes of silence, she said, "I have been trying to discover why it is absolute pleasure to suffer pain for those we love." "Pleasure in pain! You speak riddles." "I do," she replied, raising her head, "but I have divined this. The great pleasure of love is derived from sympathy, the feeling of union, of unity. Anything that makes us alive to the sense of love, that imprints deeper on our plastic consciousness the knowledge of the existence of our affection, causes an increase of happiness. There are two things to which we are most sensitive, pleasure and pain. But habit can somewhat dull the first, and that which was in its newness ecstasy, our being joined forever, becomes, like the air we breathe, a thing we could not live without, but yet in which we are rather passively than actively happy. But when pain comes to awaken us to a true sense of how much we love, when we suffer for one another's dear sake, the consciousness of attachment swells our hearts, we are recalled from the forgetfulness engendered by custom, and the awakening and renewal of the sense of affection brings with it a joy that sweetens to its dregs the bitterest cup." "Encourage this philosophy, dear Ethel," replied Villiers. "You will need it, but it shames me to think that I am your teacher in this mournful truth." As he spoke, his whole frame was agitated by tenderness and grief. Ethel could see by the dull firelight a tear gather on his eyelashes. It fell upon her hand. She threw her arms round him and pressed him to her heart with a passionate gush of weeping, occasioned partly by remorse at having so moved him, and partly by her heart's overflowing with the dear security of being loved. They had but a little recovered from this scene when the waiter, bringing in lights, announced Miss Derham. Her coming had been full of disasters. After many threatenings and much time consumed in clumsy repairs, her hackney coach had fairly broken down. She had walked the rest of the way, but they were much further from town than she expected, and thus she accounted for her delay. She brought no news, but held in her hand the letter that contained the means of freeing them from their awkward predicament. "We will not stay another minute in this cursed place," said Villiers. "We will go immediately to Salt Hill, where I intended to take you to-morrow. I can return by one of the many stages which pass continually, to keep my appointment with Gayland, and be back with you again by night. So if these stupid people possess a post-chaise, we will be gone directly." Ethel was well pleased with this arrangement, and it was put in execution immediately. The chaise and horses were easily procured. They set Fanny down in their way through town. Ethel tried to repay her kindness by heartfelt thanks, and she, in her placid way, showed clearly how pleased she was to serve them. Leaving her in Piccadilly, not far from her own door, they pursued their way to Salt Hill, and it seemed as if, in this mere change of place, they had escaped from a kind of prison, to partake again in the immunities and comforts of civilized life. Ethel was considerably fatigued when she arrived, and her husband feared that he had tasked her strength too far. The falling and fallen snow clogged up the roads, and their journey had been long. She slept, indeed, the greater part of the way, her head resting on him, and her languor and physical suffering were soothed by emotions the most balmy and by the gladdening sense of confidence and security. They arrived at Salt Hill late in the evening. The hours were precious, for early on the following day Villiers was obliged to return to town. On inquiry, he found that his best mode was to go by a night coach from Bath, which would pass at 7 in the morning. They were awake half the night, talking of their hopes, their plans, their probable deliverance from their besetting annoyances. By this time Ethel had taught her own phraseology, and Villiers had learned to believe that whatever must happen would fall upon both, and that no separation could take place fraught with any good to either. When Ethel awoke, late in the morning, Villiers was gone. Her watch told her indeed that it was near 10 o'clock, and that he must have departed long before. She felt inclined to reproach him for leaving her, though only for a few hours, without an interchange of adieu. In truth, she was vexed that he was not there. The world appeared to her so blank, without his voice to welcome her back to it from out of the regions of sleep. While this slight cloud of ill humour, may it be called, was passing over her mind, she perceived a little note, left by her husband, lying on her pillow. Kissing it 1,000 times, she read its contents, as if they possessed talismanic power. They breathed the most passionate tenderness. They besought her, as she loved him, to take care of herself, and to keep up her spirits until his return, which would be as speedy as the dove flies back to its nest, where its sweet mate fondly expects him. With these assurances and blessings to cheer her, Ethel arose. The sun poured its wintry yet cheering beams into the parlour, and the sparkling, snow-clad earth glittered beneath. She wrapped herself in her cloak and walked into the garden of the hotel. Long immured in London, Living as if its fogs were the universal vesture of all things, her spirits rose to exultation and delight as she looked on the blue sky spread cloudlessly around. As the pure breeze freshened her cheek, a kind of transport seized her. Her spirit took wings. She felt as if she could float on the bosom of the air, as if there was a sympathy in nature, whose child and nursling she was, to welcome her back to her haunts and to reward her bounteously for coming. The trees, all leafless and snow-bedecked, were friends and intimates. She kissed their rough barks, and then laughed at her own folly at being so rapt. The snowdrop, as it peeped from the ground, was a thing of wonder and mystery, and the shapes of frost, beautiful forms to be worshipped. All sorrow, all care passed away, and left her mind as clear and bright as the unclouded heavens that bent over her. End of Volume 3, Chapter 6. Recording by Linda Johnson. Section 43 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley. Volume 3, Chapter 7. Herein shall my captivity be made my happiness, since what I lose in freedom I regain with interest. Beaumont and Fletcher. The glow of enthusiasm and gladness thus kindled in her soul faded slowly as the sun descended and human tenderness returned in full tide upon her. She longed for Edward to speak to. When would he come back? She walked a little way on the London road. She returned. Still her patience was not exhausted. The sun's orb grew red and dusky as it approached the horizon. She returned to the house. It was yet early. Edward could not be expected yet. He had promised to come as soon as possible, but he had prepared her for the likelihood of his arrival only by the mail at night. It was long since she had written to Seville. Cooped up in town, saddened by her separation from her husband, or enjoying the brief hours of reunion, she had felt disinclined to write. Her enlivened spirits now prompted her to pour out some of their overflowings to him. She did not allude to any of the circumstances of their situation, for Edward had forbidden that topic. Still she had much to say, for her heart was full of benevolence to all mankind. Besides her attachment to her husband, the prospect of becoming a mother within a few months opened another source of tenderness. There seemed to be a superabundance of happiness within her, a portion of which she desired to impart to those she loved. Daylight had long vanished, and Villiers did not return. She felt uneasy. Of course he would come by the mail, yet if he should not, what could prevent him? Conjectures would force themselves on her. Unreasonable, she told herself, yet her doubts were painful, and she listened attentively each time that the sound of wheels grew and again faded upon her ear. If the vehicle stopped, she was in a state of excitation that approached alarm. She knew not what she feared, yet her disquiet increased into anxiety. "Shall I ever see him again?" were words that her lips did not utter, and yet which lingered in her heart, although unaccompanied by any precise idea to her understanding. She had given 1,000 messages to the servants, and at last the mail arrived. She heard a step. It was the waiter. "The gentleman is not come, ma'am," he said. "I knew it," she thought. Yet why? Why? At one time she resolved to set off for town. Yet whither to go? Where to find him? An idea struck her, that he had missed the mail, but as he would not leave her a prey to uncertainty, he would come by some other conveyance. She got a little comfort from this notion, and resumed her occupation of waiting, though the vagueness of her expectations rendered her 1,000 times more restless than before. And all was vain. The mail had arrived at 11 o'clock. At 12 she retired to her room. She read again and again his note, his injunction, that she should take care of herself, induced her to go to bed at a little after 1, but sleep was still far from her. Till she could no longer expect, till it became certain that it must be morning before he could come, she did not close her eyes. As her last hope quitted her, she wept bitterly. Where was the joyousness of the morning, the exuberant delight with which her veins had tingled, which had painted life as a blessing? She hid her face in her pillow and gave herself up to tears, till sleep at last stole over her senses. Early in the morning her door opened and her curtain was drawn aside. She awoke immediately and saw Fanny Derham standing at her bedside. "Edward, where is he?" she exclaimed, starting up. "Well, quite well," replied Fanny. "Do not alarm yourself, dear Mrs. Villiers. He has been arrested." "I must go to him immediately. Leave me for a little while, dear Fanny. I will dress and come to you. Do you order the chaise meanwhile. I can hear everything as we are going to town." Ethel trembled violently. Her speech was rapid but inarticulate. The paleness that overspread her face, blanching even her marble brow, and the sudden contraction of her features alarmed Fanny. The words she had used in communicating her intelligence were cabalistic to Ethel, and her fears were the more intolerable because mysterious and undefined. The blood trickled cold in her veins, and a chilly moisture stood on her forehead. She exerted herself violently to conquer this weakness, but it shackled her powers as bands of rope would her limbs, and after a few moments she sank back on her pillow almost bereft of life. Fanny sprang to the bell, then sprinkled her with water. Some salts were procured from the landlady, and gradually the colour revisited her cheeks, and her frame resumed its functions. An hysteric fit, the first she had ever had, left her at last exhausted, but more composed. She herself became frightened lest illness should keep her from Villiers. She exerted herself to become tranquil, and lay for some time without speaking or moving. A little refreshment contributed to restore her, and she turned to Fanny with a faint sweet smile. "You see," said she, "what a weak, foolish thing I am. But I am quite well now, quite rallied. There must be no more delay." Her cheerful voice and lively manner gave her friend confidence. Fanny was one who believed much in the mastery of mind, and felt sure that nothing would be so prejudicial to Mrs. Villiers as contradiction, and obstacles put in the way of her attaining the object of her wishes. In spite, therefore, of the good people about who insisted that the most disastrous consequences would ensue, she ordered the horses and prepared for their immediate journey to town. Ethel repaid her cares with smiles, while she restrained her curiosity, laid, as it were, a check on her too impatient movements, and forced a calm of manner which gave her friend courage to proceed. It was not until they were on their way that the object of their journey was mentioned. Fanny then spoke of the arrest as a trifling circumstance, mentioned bail, and 20 things which Ethel only comprehended to be mysterious methods of setting him free. And then, also, she asked the history of what had happened. The tale was soon told. The moment Mr. Villiers had entered Piccadilly, he had caused a coach to be called, but on passing to it from the stage, 2 men entered it with him, whose errand was too easily explained. He had driven first to his solicitors, hoping to put everything in train for his instant liberation. The day was consumed in these fruitless endeavours. He did not give up hope till past 10 at night, when he sent to Fanny, asking her to go down to Mrs. Villiers as early as possible in the morning, and to bring her up to town. His wish was, he said, that Ethel should take up her abode at Mrs. Derham's till this affair could be arranged, and they were enabled to leave London. His note was hurried. He promised that another, more explicit, should await his wife on her arrival. "You will tell the driver," said Ethel, when this story was finished, "to drive to Edward's prison. I would not stay away 5 minutes from him in this present situation to purchase the universe." Any one but Miss Derham might have resisted Ethel's wish, have argued with her and irritated her by the display of obstacles and inconveniences. It was not Fanny's method ever to oppose the desires of others. They knew best, she affirmed, their own sensations and what was most fitting for them. What is best for me, habit, education, and a different texture of character, may render the worst for them. In the present instance, also, she saw that Ethel's feelings were almost too high wrought for her strength, that opposition, by making a further call on her powers, might upset them wholly. She had, besides, the deepest respect for her attachment to her husband, and was willing to reward it by bringing her to him without delay. Having thus fortunately fallen into reasonable hands, guided by one who could understand her character, and not torture her by forcing notions the opposite of those on which she felt herself compelled to act, Ethel became tranquil, and saw the mere panic of inexperience in her previous excessive alarm. They now approached London. Fanny called the post-boy to the window of the chaise, and gave him directions, at which he a little stared, but said nothing. She gave things their own names, and never dreamt of saving appearances, as it is called. What ought to be done, that she dared do in the face of the whole world, and therefore to make a mystery of their destination, never once occurred to her. They drove through the long interminable suburbs, through Piccadilly and the Strand. Ethel's cheeks flushed with the excitement, and something like apprehension made her heart flutter. She had endeavoured to form an image in her own mind of whither they were going. It was vague and therefore frightful. But Edward was there, and she also would share the horrors of his prison-house. They passed through Temple Bar, and going down an obscure street or two, stopped at a dingy doorway. "This is not right," said Ethel, almost gasping for breath. "This is not a prison." "Something very like it, as you will find too soon," said her friend. Still, Ethel's imagination was relieved by the absence of the massy walls, the portentous gates, the gloomy immensity of an absolute prison. The door of the house being opened, Ethel stepped out from the chaise and asked for Mr. Villiers. The man whom she addressed hesitated, but Ethel had learnt one only worldly lesson, which was, whenever she needed the services of people of the lower orders, to disseminate money plentifully. Her purse was in her hand, and she gave a sovereign to the man, who then at once showed them upstairs, which she ascended, though every limb nearly refused to perform its office as she approached the spot where again she was to see him whose image lived eternally in her heart, and whom it was the sole joy of her life to wait on, to be sheltered by, to live near. The door was opened. In the dingy, dusty room beside the fire, which looked as if it could not burn, and was never meant to warm even the black neglected grate, Villiers sat, reading. His first emotion was shame when he saw Ethel enter. There was no accord between her spotless loveliness and his squalid prison-room. Anyone who has seen a sunbeam suddenly enter and light up a scene of housewifely neglect and vulgar discomfort, and felt how obtrusive it rendered all that might be half forgotten in the shade, can picture how the simple elegance of Ethel displayed yet more distinctly to her husband the worse than beggarly scene in which she found him. His cheeks flushed, and almost he would have turned away. He would have reproached, but a tenderness and an elevation of feeling animated her expressive countenance, which turned the current of his thoughts. Whether it were their fate to suffer the extremes of fortune in the savage wilderness, or in the more appalling privations of civilized life, love and the poetry of love accompanied her, and gilded and irradiated the commonest forms of penury. She looked at him, and her eyes then glanced to the barred windows. As Fanny and their conductor left them, she heard the key turn in the lock with an impertinent, intrusive loudness. She felt pained for him, but for herself it was as if the world and all its cares were locked out, and as if, in this near association with him, she reaped the reward of all her previous anxiety. There was no repining in her thoughts, no dejection in her manner. Villiers could read in her open countenance as plainly as through the clearest crystal the sentiments that were passing in her mind. It was something more satisfied than resignation, more contented than fortitude. It was a knowledge that, whatever evil might attend her lot, the good so far outweighed it that, for his sake only, could she advert to any feelings of distress. It was a consciousness of being in her place and of fulfilling her duty, accompanied by a sort of rapture in remembering how thrice dear and hallowed that duty was. Angels could not feel as she did, for they cannot sacrifice to those they love. Yet there was in her that absence of all self-emanating pain which is the characteristic of what we are told of the angelic essences. As when at night autumnal winds are howling and vast masses of winged clouds are driven with indescribable speed across the sky, we note the islands of dark ether, built round by the white fleecy shapes, and as we mark the stars which gem their unfathomable depth, silence and sublime tranquillity appear to have found a home in that deep vault, and we love to dwell on the peace and beauty that live there, while the clouds still rush on, and the face of the lower heaven is more mutable than water. Thus the mind of Ethel, surrounded by the world's worst forms of adversity, showed clear and serene, entirely possessed by the repose of love. It was impossible but that, in spite of shame and regret, Villiers should not participate in these feelings. He gave himself up to the softening influence. He knew not how to repine on his own account. Ethel's affection demanded to stand in place of prosperity, and he could not refuse to admit so dear a claim. The door had closed on them, and every outlet to liberty or the enjoyment of life was barred up. Edward drew Ethel towards him and kissed her fondly. Their eyes met, and the speechless tenderness that beamed from hers reached his heart and soothed every ruffled feeling. Sitting together and interchanging a few words of comfort and hope, mingled with kind looks and affectionate caresses, they neither of them remembered indignity nor privation. The tedious mechanism of civilized life and the odious interference of their fellow creatures were forgotten, and they were happy. End of Volume 3, Chapter 7. Recording by Linda Johnson. Section 44 of Lodore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lodore by Mary Shelley. Volume 3, Chapter 8. Veggo purtroppo che favola è la vita, e la favola mia non è compita. Petrarca. The darker months of winter had passed away, and the chilly, blighting English spring begun. Towards the end of March, Lady Lodore came to town. She had long ago, in her days of wealth, fitted up a house in Park Lane, so she returned to it as to a home, if home it might be called, where no one welcomed her, where none sat beside her at the domestic hearth. For the first time she felt keenly this circumstance. During her mother's lifetime she had had her constantly for a companion, and afterwards, as events pressed upon her, and while the anguish she felt upon Horatio Saville's marriage was still fresh, she had not reverted to her lonely position as the source of pain. The haughty, the firm, the self-exalting soul of Cornelia had borne up long. She had often felt that she walked on the borders of a precipice, and that, if once she admitted sentiments of regret, she should plunge without retrieve into a gulf, dark, portentous, inextricable. She had often repeated to herself that fate should not vanquish her, and that in spite of despair she would be happy. It is true that the misery occasioned by Seville's marriage was a canker at her heart, for which there was no cure, but she had recourse to dissipation that she might endeavour to forget it. A sad and ineffectual remedy. She was surrounded by admirers, whom she disdained, and by friends to whom she would have died rather than betray the naked misery of her soul. She had never planned nor thought of marriage. The report concerning the Earl of D was one of those which the world always makes current, when two persons of opposite sexes are, by any chance, thrown much together. His sister was Lady Lodore's friend, and she had chaperoned her, and been of assistance to her during the courtship of the gentleman who was at present her husband. It was their house that Lady Lodore had just quitted on arriving in town. The new-born happiness of early wedded life had been a scene to call her back to thoughts which were the sources of the bitterest anguish. She abhorred herself that she could envy, that she could desire to exchange places with any created being. She abridged her visit, and fancied that she should regain peace in the independence of her own home. But the enjoyment of liberty was cold in her heart, and loneliness added a freezing chilliness to her feeling. The mind of Cornelia was much above the world she lived in, though she had sacrificed all to it, and, so to speak, much above herself. Take pride from her, and there was understanding, magnanimity, and great kindliness of disposition, but pride had been the wall of China to shut up all her better qualities, and to keep them from communicating with the world beyond. Pride, which grew strong by resistance, and towered above every aggressor. Pride, which crumbled away when time and change were its sole assailants, till her inner being was left unprotected and bare. She found herself alone in the world. She felt that her life was aimless, unprofitable, blank. She was humiliated and saddened by her relative position in the world. She did not think of her daughter as a resource. She was in the hands of her enemies, and no hope lay there. She entertained the belief that Mrs. Villiers was weak both in character and understanding, and that to make any attempt to interest herself in her would end in disappointment, if not disgust. Imagining, as we are all apt to do, how we should act in another person's place, she had formed a notion of what she would have done had she been Ethel, and as nothing was done, she almost despised and quite pitied her. No, there was no help. She was alone. None loved, none cared for her, and the flower of the field, which a child plucks and wears for an hour and then casts aside, was of more worth than she. Every amusement grew tedious, all society vacant and dull. When she came back from dinners or assemblies to her luxurious but empty abode, the darkest thoughts engendered by spleen hung over its threshold and welcomed her return. At such times she would dismiss her attendant and remain half the night by her fireside, encouraging sickly reveries, struggling with the fate that bound her, yet unable in any way to make an effort for freedom. Time, thus would her thoughts fashion themselves. Yes, time rolls on, and what does it bring? I live in a desert. Its barren sands feed my hourglass, and they come out fruitless as they went in. Months change their names, years their ciphers. My brow is sadly trenched. The bloom of youth is faded. My mind gathers wrinkles. What will become of me? Hopes of my youth, where are ye? My aspirations, my pride, my belief that I could grasp and possess all things. Alas, there is nothing of all this. My soul lies in the dust, and I look up to know that I have been playing with shadows, and that I am fallen forever. What do I see around me? The tide of life is ebbing fast. I had fancied that pearls and gold would have been left by the retiring waves, and I find only barren, lonely sands. No voice reaches me from across the waters. No one stands beside me on the shore. Would, oh, would I could lay my head on the spray-sprinkled beach and sleep forever. This is madness. These incoherent images that throng my brain are the ravings of insanity. Yet what greater madness than to know that love, affection, the charities of life, the hopes of existence, are empty words for me? Am I indeed to have done with these? What is it that still moves up and down in my soul, making me feel as if something might yet be accomplished? Is it that the ardor of youth is not yet tamed? Alas, my youth has departed forever. Yet wherefore these sighs which wrap an eternity of wretchedness in their evanescent breath? Why these tears that, flowing from the inmost fountains of the soul, endeavor to give passage to the flood of sorrow that deluges and overwhelms it? The husband of my youth! The thought of him passes like a shadow across me. Had he borne with me a little longer, had I submitted to his control, how different my destiny had been! But I will not think of that. I do not. A mightier storm than any he could raise has swept across me since, and laid all waste. My soul has been set upon a hope which has vanished, and desolation has come in its room. Could God, in his anger, bestow a bitterer curse on a condemned spirit than that which weighs on me when I reflect that through my own fault I lost him, whom but to see was paradise? The thought haunts me like a crime, yet when is it absent from me? It sleeps with me, rises with me. It is by me now, and I would willingly die only to dismiss it forever. Miserable Cornelia, thou hast been courted, lauded, waited on, loved. It is all over. I am alone. My poor, poor mother, my much reviled, my dearest mother. By you at least I was valued. Ah, why are you gone, leaving your wretched child alone? Oh, that I could take wings and rise from out of the abyss into which I am fallen! Can I not, myself being miserable, take pleasure in the pleasure of others, and by force of strong sympathy forget my selfish woes? With whom can I sympathize? None desire my care, and all would repay my officiousness with ingratitude, perhaps with scorn. Once I could assist the poor. Now I am poor myself. My limited means scarce suffice to keep me in that station in society from which, did I once descend, I were indeed trampled upon and destroyed forever. Tears rush from my eyes. My heart sinks within me as I look forward. Again, the same cares, the same coil, the same bitter result. Hopes held out only to be crushed. Affections excited only to be scattered to the winds. I blamed myself for struggling too much with fate, for rowing against wind and tide, for resolving to control the events that form existence. Now I yield. I have long yielded. I have let myself drift, as I hoped, into a quiet creek, where indifference and peace ruled the hour, and lo, it is a whirlpool to swallow all I had left of enjoyment upon earth. It was not until she had exhausted herself by these gloomy and restless reflections that she laid her head upon her pillow and tried to sleep. Morning usually dawned before she closed her eyes, and it was nearly noon before she rose, weary and unrefreshed. It was with a struggle that she commenced a new day, a day that was to be cheered by no event, nor feeling capable of animating her to any sense of joy. She had never occupied herself by intellectual exertion. Her employments had been the cultivation of what are called accomplishments merely, and when now she reverted to these, it was with bitterness. She remembered the interval when she had been inspirited by the delightful wish to please Horatio. Now none cared how the forlorn Cornelia passed her time. No one would hang enraptured on her voice, or hail with gladness the development of some new talent. It is the same, she thought, how I get rid of the heavy hours, so that they go. I have but to give myself up to the sluggish stream that bears me on to old age, not more bereft or unregarded than these wretched years. Thus she lingered idly through the morning, her only enjoyment being when she secured to herself a solitary drive, and, reclining back in her carriage, felt herself safe from every intrusion, and yet enjoying a succession of objects that a little varied the tenor of her thoughts. She had deserted the park, and sought unfrequented drives in the environs of London. Evening at last came, and with it her uninteresting engagements, which yet she found better than entire seclusion. Forced to rouse herself to adopt, as a mask, the smiling appearance which had been natural to her for many years, she often abhorred every one around her, and yet, hating herself more, took refuge among them from her own society. Her chief care was to repress any manifestation of her despair, which too readily rose to her lips or in her eyes. The glorious hues of sunset, the subduing sounds of music, even the sight of a beautiful girl, resplendent with happiness and youth, moving gracefully in dance, had power to move her to tears. Her blood seemed to curdle and grow thick, while gloomy shadows mantled over her features. Often she could scarcely forbear expressing the bitterness of her feelings, and indulging in acrimonious remarks on the deceits of life and the inanity of all things. It seemed to her sometimes that she must die if she did not give vent to the still increasing horror with which she regarded the whole system of the world. Nor were her sufferings always thus negative. One evening especially, a young travelled gentleman approached her, with all the satisfaction painted on his countenance, which he felt at having secured a topic for the entertainment of the fashionable Lady Lodore. "You are intimate with the Misses Saville," he said. "What charming girls they are! I have just left them at Naples, where they have been spending the Carnival. I saw them almost every day, and capitally we enjoyed ourselves. Their Italian sister-in-law spirited them up to mask, and to make a real Carnival of it. A most lovely woman, that. Did you ever see Mrs. Saville, Lady Lodore?" "Never," replied his auditress. "Such eyes! Gazelles and stars and suns, and the whole range of poetic imagery, might be sought in vain to do justice to her large dark eyes. She is very young, scarcely 20, and to see her with child is positively a finer tableau than any Raphael or Correggio in the world. She has a little girl, not a year old, with golden hair and eyes as black as the mother's, the most beautiful little thing, and so intelligent. Saville dotes on it. No wonder he is not himself handsome, you know, though the lovely Clorinda would stab me if she heard me say so. She positively adores him. You should have seen them together." Lady Lodore turned on him one of her sweetest smiles, and in her blandest tone said, "If you could only get me an ice from that servant who I see immovable behind those dear, wonderful dowagers, you would so oblige me." He was gone in a minute, and on his return Lady Lodore was so deeply engrossed in being persuaded to go to the next drawing-room by the young and new-married Countess of G that she could only reward him with another heavenly smile. He was obliged to take his Carnival at Naples to some other listener. Cornelia scarcely closed her eyes that night. The thought of the happy wife and lovely child of Seville pierced her as with remorse. She had entirely broken off her acquaintance with his family, so that she was ignorant of Clorinda's disposition, and readily fancied that she was as happy as she believed that the wife of Horatio Seville must be. She would not acknowledge that she was wicked enough to repine at her felicity, but that he should be rendered happy by any other woman than herself, that any other woman should have become the sharer of his dearest affections, stung her to the core. Yet why should she regret? She were well exchanged for one so lovely and so young. At the age of 34, which she had now reached, Cornelia persuaded herself that the name of beauty was a mockery as applied to her, though her own glass might have told her otherwise, for time had dealt lightly with her, so that the extreme fascination of her manner and the animation and intelligence of her countenance made her compete with many younger beauties. She felt that she was deteriorated from the angelic being she had seemed when she first appeared as Lodore's bride, and this made all compliments show false and vain. Now she figured to herself the dark eyes of the Neapolitan, and easily believed that the memory of her would contrast like a faded picture with the rich hues of Clorinda's face, while her sad and withered feelings were in yet greater opposition to the vivacity she had heard described and praised, to the triumphant and glad feelings of a beloved wife. It seemed to her as if she must weep forever, and yet that tears were unavailing to diminish in any degree the sorrow that weighed so heavily at her heart. These reflections sat like a nightmare on her pillow, troubling the repose she in vain courted. She arose in the morning, scarcely conscious that she had slept at all, languid from exhaustion, her sufferings blunted by their very excess. End of Volume 3, Chapter 8. Recording by Linda Johnson.